Desire by James Stephens, published 1920. Recorded for Dreams, Collection 1, Stories and Poems by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in January 2020. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Desire by James Stephens. He was quite excited as he told the story to his wife, and in the telling he revealed to her a depth of credulity of which she would not have believed him capable. He was a hard-headed man, and conducted his business on hard-headed principles. Indeed, he had conducted his courtship and matrimonial affairs in a manner which she would not have termed reckless or romantic. When, therefore, she found him excited, and over such a story, she did not know what to think. She ended by agreeing with him, not because her reason was satisfied or even touched, but simply because he was excited, and women generally welcome anything which disturbs or varies the dull round of use and wont, and will bathe in excitement whenever they get the chance. This was the story he told. As he was walking down Grafton Street to lunch, a motor car came spinning down the road at a speed much too dangerous for that narrow and always congested thoroughfare. A man was walking in front of him, and just as the car came behind, this man stepped off the path with a view to crossing the road. He did not even look behind as he stepped off. Her husband on that moment stretched forth a long muscular arm that swept the man back to the pavement 1 second before the car went blaring and buzzing by. "If I had not been there," said her husband. The two men grinned at each other, her husband smiling with good fellowship, the other crinkling with amusement and gratitude. They walked together down the street, and they had lunch together. They sat for a long time after lunch, smoking innumerable cigarettes, and engaged in a conversation which she could never have believed her husband would have stood for 10 minutes. And they parted with an expressed wish from her husband that they should meet again on the following day, and a wordless smile from the man. He had neither ratified nor negatived the arrangement. "I hope he'll turn up," said her husband. It was this conversation had excited her man, for it had drawn him into a mental atmosphere to which he was a stranger, and he had found himself moving there with such ease and pleasure that he wished to get back to it as often and with as little delay as possible. Briefly, as he explained it to her, the atmosphere was religious, and while it was entirely intellectual, it was more heady and exhilarating than the emotional religion to which he had been accustomed and from which he had long since passed. He tried to describe his companion, but had such ill success that she could not remember afterwards whether he was tall or short, fat or thin, fair or dark. It was the man's eyes only he succeeded in emphasizing, and these, it appeared, were eyes such as he had never before seen in a human face. That also, he said, was a wrong way of putting it, for his eyes were exactly like everybody else's. It was the way he looked through them that was different, something very steady, very ardent, immensely quiet and powerful was using those eyes for purposes of vision. He had never met anyone who looked at him so directly, so comprehendingly, so agreeably. "You are in love," said she with a laugh. After this, her husband's explanations became more explanatory, but not less confused, until she found that they were both, with curious unconsciousness, in the middle of a fairy tale. "He asked me," said her husband, "what was the thing I wished for beyond all things." "That is the most difficult question I have ever been invited to answer," he went on, "and for nearly half an hour we sat quietly thinking it out and discussing various magnificences and chances in life. I had all the usual thoughts, and, of course, the first of them was wealth. I mentioned it too tentatively as a possibility, and he agreed that it was worth considering, but after a while I knew that I did not want money." "One always has need of money," said his wife. "In a way that is true," said he, "but not in this way. for as I thought it over, I remembered that we have no children, and that we have few desires which the money we have already gathered cannot buy. Also, we are fairly well off. We have enough in the stocking to last our time, even if I ceased from business, which I am not going to do, and in short, I discovered that money or its purchasing power had not any particular advantages to offer. All the same, said she, and halted with her eyes fixed on bonnets far away in time and space. All the same, he agreed with a smile. I could not think of anything worth wishing for, he continued. I mentioned health and wisdom, and we spoke of these, but judging myself by the standard of the world in which we move, I concluded that both my health and knowledge were as good as the next man's, and I thought if I elected to become wiser than my contemporaries, I might be a very lonely person for the rest of my days. Yes, she said thoughtfully, I am glad you did not ask to be made wise, unless you could have asked it for the both of us. I asked him in the end what he would advise me to demand, but he replied that he could not advise me at all. Behind everything stands desire, said he, and you must find out your desire. I asked him then, if the opportunity came to him, what he would ask for, not in order that I might copy his wish, but from sheer curiosity. And he replied that he would not ask for anything, and I was about to adopt that attitude. Oh, said his wife, when an idea came to me. Here I am, I said to myself, 48 years of age, rich enough, sound enough in wind and limb, and as wise as I can afford to be. What is there now belonging to me, absolutely mine, but from which I must part and which I would like to keep? And I saw that the thing which was leaving me day by day, second by second, irretrievably and inevitably, was my 48 years. And I thought I would like to continue at the age of 48 until my time was up. I did not ask to live forever or any of that nonsense, but I asked to be allowed to stay at the age of 48 years with all the equipment of my present state unimpaired. You should not have asked for such a thing, said his wife, a little angrily. It is not fair to me. You are older than I am now, but in a few years this will mean that I shall be needlessly older than you. I think it was not a loyal wish. I thought of that objection, said he, and I also thought that I was past the age at which certain things matter, and that both temperamentally and in the matter of years I was proof against, well, say, feminine attractions, or femininity of any kind. It seemed to me to be right, so I just registered my wish with him. What did he say? She queried. He did not say anything. He just nodded and began to talk again of other matters, religion, life, death, mind, a host of things, which for all the diversity they seem to have when I enumerate them, were yet one single theme. I feel a more contented man tonight than I have ever felt, he continued, and I feel in some curious way a different person from the man I was yesterday. Here his wife woke up, as it were, from the conversation, and began to laugh. You are a foolish man, said she, and I am just as bad. If anyone were to hear us talking this solemn silliness, he would have a right to mock at us. He laughed heartily with her, and after a supper they went to bed. During the night his wife had a dream. She dreamt that a ship set off for the polar seas on an expedition in which she was not sufficiently interested to find out its reason. The ship departed with her on board. For a time she was concerned with baggage and with counting and going over various articles she had brought against the Arctic weather. She had thick woolen stockings. She had skin boots, all hairy inside, all pliable and wrinkled without. She had a great skin cap shaped like a helmet and fitting down in a cape over the shoulders. She had even, and it did not astonish her, a pair of very baggy fur trousers. She had a sleeping sack. She had an enormous quantity of things, and everybody in the expedition was equipped, if not with the same things, at least similarly. These traps were an unending subject of conversation aboard, And although days and weeks passed, the talk of the ship hovered about and fell continually into the subject of warm clothing. There came a day when the weather began to be perceptibly colder, so cold indeed that she was tempted to draw on these wonderful breeches and fit her head into that most cozy hat. But she did not do so, for, and everybody on the ship explained it to her, it was necessary that she should accustom herself to the feeling of cold, and she was further informed the chill which she was now feeling was nothing to the chill she would presently have to bear. It seemed good advice, and she decided that as long as she could bear the cold she would do so, and would not put on any protective covering. Thus, when the cold became really intense, she would be to some degree ready for it, and would not suffer so much. But steadily and day by day it became colder, and now they were in wild and whirling seas, wherein great green and white icebergs went sailing by, and all about the ship little hummocks of ice bobbed and surged, and went under and came up, and the gray water slashed and hissed against and on top of these small hillocks. Her hands were so chilly that she had to put them under her armpits to keep any warmth in them, and her feet were in a worse condition. They had begun to pain her, so she decided that on the next day she would put on her winter equipment and would not mind what anybody said to the contrary. "It is cold enough," said she, "for my Arctic trousers and my warm soft boots and my great furry gloves. I will put them on in the morning." For it was then almost night, and she meant to go to bed at once. She did go to bed, and she lay there quite cold and miserable. In the morning she was yet colder, and immediately on rising she looked about for the winter clothing which she had laid ready by the side of her bunk the night before, but she could not find them. She was forced to dress in her usual rather thin clothes, and having done so she went on deck. When she got to the side of the vessel, she found that the world about her was changed. The sea had disappeared. Far as the eye could go was a level plain of ice, not white, but gray, and over it there lowered a sky gray as itself and of almost the same shade. Across this waste there blew a bitter and piercing wind, so that her ears tingled and stung. No one was moving on the ship, and the dead silence which brooded on the snow lay heavy and almost solid on the vessel. She ran to the other side and found that the whole ship's company had landed and were staring at her from a little distance of the land, and these people were as silent as the frozen air, as the frozen ship. They stared at her and made no move and made no sound. She noticed that they were all dressed in their winter furs, and while she stood, ice began to creep into her veins. One of the ship's company suddenly strode forward a few paces and held up a bundle in his mittened hand. She saw the bundle contained her clothes, her broad furry trousers, her great cozy helmet and gloves. To get from the ship to the ice was painful but not difficult, for a rope ladder was hanging against the side, and down this she went. The rungs felt hard as iron, for they were frozen stiff, and the touch of those glassy surfaces bit into her tender hand like fire. But she got to the ice and went across it towards her companions. Then, to her dismay, to her terror, all these suddenly, with one unexpressed accord, turned and began to run swiftly away from her, and she, with a heart that could scarcely beat, took after them. Every few paces she fell, for her shoes could not grip on the ice, and each time she fell those monsters stood and turned and watched her, and the man who had her clothes waved the bundle at her and danced grotesquely, silently. She continued running, sliding, falling, picking herself up until her breath went, and she came to a halt, unable to move a limb further, and scarcely able to breathe, and this time they did not stay to look at her. They continued running, but now with greater and greater speed, and she saw them become black specks away on the white distance, and she saw them disappear, and there was nothing left where she stared but the long white miles, and the terrible silence, and the cold. How cold it was! And with that there rose again a little wind, keen as a razor, which whipped into her face, swirled about her ankles like a whip, and stabbed under her armpits like a dagger. "I am cold," she muttered. She looked backwards whence she had come, but the ship was no longer in sight, and she could not remember in what direction it lay. Then she began to run in any direction. Indeed, she ran in every direction to find the ship, for when she had taken 100 steps in one way, she thought frantically, "This is not the way," and at once she began to run on the opposite road. But run as she might, she could not get warm. It was colder she got, and then she slipped again, and went sliding down a hollow, faster and faster. She came to the brink of a cleft, and swished over this, and down into a hole of ice, and there she lay. "I shall die," she said. "I shall fall asleep here and die." Then she awoke. She opened her eyes directly on the window, and saw the dawn struggling with the darkness, a film of grayish light which framed the window, but did not lift the obscurity of the room, and she lay for a second, smiling to herself at the grotesque dream, and thanking God it had only been a dream. The next second she felt that she was cold. She pulled the clothes more tightly about her, and she spoke to her husband. "How miserably cold it is," she said. She turned over in the bed and lay against him for warmth, and then she found that the atrocious cold came from him, that it was he. She leaped out of the bed with a scream, switched on the light, and bent over him. He was stone dead. He was stone cold, and she stood by him, shivering and whimpering. End of Desire by James Stephens.
A Dream by Helen Hunt Jackson. Read for Dreams Collection 1, Stories and Poems by Nemo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Dream by Helen Hunt Jackson. I dreamed that I was dead and crossed the heavens, heavens after heavens, with burning feet and swift, and cried, "O God, where art thou?" I left one on earth, whose burden I would pray thee lift. I was so dead, I wondered at no thing, not even that the angels slowly turned their faces, speechless, as I hurried by. Beneath my feet the golden pavements burned. Nor at the first that I could not find God, because the heavens stretched endlessly like space. At last a terror seized my very soul. I seemed alone in all the crowded place. Then, sudden, one compassionate cried out, though like the rest his face from me he turned, as I were one no angel might regard. Beneath my feet the golden pavements burned. No more in heaven than earth will he find God, who does not know his loving mercy swift, but waits the moment consummate and ripe, each burden from each human soul to lift. Though I was dead, I died again for shame. Lonely, to flee from heaven again I turned. The ranks of angels looked away from me. Beneath my feet the golden pavements burned. End of A Dream by Helen Hunt Jackson.
What the Moon Brings by H.P. Lovecraft. Read and recorded for Dreams Collection 1, Stories and Poems by Dan Grzinski. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What the Moon Brings by H.P. Lovecraft. I hate the moon. I am afraid of it, for when it shines on certain scenes familiar and loved, it sometimes makes them unfamiliar and hideous. It was in the spectral summer, when the moon shone down on the old garden where I wandered. The spectral summer of narcotic flowers and humid seas of foliage that bring wild and many-colored dreams. And as I walked by the shallow crystal stream, I saw unwanted ripples tipped with yellow light, as if those placid waters were drawn on in restless currents to strange oceans that are not in the world. Silent and sparkling, bright and baleful, those moon-cursed waters hurried I knew not whither, whilst from the embowered banks white lotus blossoms fluttered one by one in the opiate night wind, and dropped despairingly into the stream, swirling away horribly under the arched carven bridge, and staring back with the sinister resignation of calm, dead faces. And as I ran along the shore, crushing sleeping flowers with heedless feet, and maddened ever by the fear of unknown things and the lure of the dead faces, I saw that the garden had no end under that moon. For where by day the walls were, there stretched now only new vistas of trees and paths, flowers and shrubs, stone idols and pagodas, and bendings of the yellow-litten stream past grassy banks and under grotesque bridges of marble. And the lips of the dead lotus faces whispered sadly and bade me follow, nor did I cease my steps till the stream became a river and joined amidst marshes of swaying reeds and beaches of gleaming sand the shore of a vast and nameless sea. Upon that sea the hateful moon shone, and over its unvocal waves weird perfumes brooded, and as I saw therein the lotus faces vanish, I longed for nets that I might capture them, and learn from them the secrets which the moon had brought upon the night. But when the moon went over to the west, and the still tide ebbed from the sullen shore, I saw in that light old spires that the waves almost uncovered, and white columns, gay with festoons of green seaweed. And knowing that to this sunken place all the dead had come, I trembled and did not wish again to speak with the lotus faces. Yet when I saw far out in the sea a black condor descend from the sky to seek rest on a vast reef, I would fain have questioned him, and asked him of those whom I had known when they were alive. This I would have asked him had he not been so far away. But he was very far, and could not be seen at all when he drew nigh that gigantic reef. So I watched the tide go out under that sinking moon, and saw gleaming the spires, the towers, and the roofs of that dead, dripping city. And as I watched, my nostrils tried to close against the perfume-conquering stench of the world's dead, for truly, in this unplaced and forgotten spot had all the flesh of the churchyards gathered for puffy sea-worms to gnaw and glut upon. Over those horrors the evil moon now hung very low, but the puffy worms of the sea need no moon to feed by. And as I watched the ripples that told of the writhing of worms beneath, I felt a new chill from afar out, whither the condor had flown, as if my flesh had caught a horror before my eyes had seen it. Nor had my flesh trembled without cause, for when I raised my eyes I saw that the waters had ebbed very low, showing much of the vast reef whose rim I had seen before. And when I saw that this reef was but the black basalt crown of a shocking icon, whose monstrous forehead now shone in the dim moonlight, and whose vile hooves must paw the hellish ooze miles below, I shrieked and shrieked, lest the hidden face rise above the waters, and lest the hidden eyes look at me after the slinking away of that leering and treacherous yellow moon. And to escape this relentless thing, I plunged gladly and unhesitatingly into the stinking shallows, where amidst weedy walls and sunken streets fat sea-worms feast upon the world's dead. End of What the Moon Brings by H.P. Lovecraft.
Dreamers by Seigfried Sassoon. Read for Dreams Collection 1, Stories and Poems by Nemo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dreamers by Seigfried Sassoon. Soldiers are citizens of death's grey land, drawing no dividend from time's tomorrows. In the great hour of destiny they stand, each with his feuds and jealousies and sorrows. Soldiers are sworn to action, they must win some flaming, fatal climax with their lives. Soldiers are dreamers when the guns begin. They think of firelit homes, clean beds, and wives. I see them in foul dugouts gnawed by rats, and in the ruined trenches lashed with rain, dreaming of things they did with balls and bats, and mocked by hopeless longing to regain bank holidays and picture shows and spats, and going to the office in the train. End of Dreamers by Seigfried Sassoon.
My Platonic Sweetheart by Mark Twain. Read for Dreams Collection 1, Stories and Poems by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. And now, My Platonic Sweetheart by Mark Twain. My Platonic Sweetheart was published in Harper's Magazine in the December 1912 issue. Note: Mark Twain was always interested in those psychic phenomena which we call dreams. His own sleep fancies were likely to be vivid, and it was his habit to recall them and to find interest and sometimes amusement in their detail. In the story which follows, he set down, and not without some fidelity to dream circumstance, a phase of what we call recurrent dreams. As the tale progressed, he felt an inclination to treat the subject more fully, more philosophically, and eventually he laid the manuscript away. The time did not come when he was moved to rewrite it, and for the pure enjoyment of it as a delicate fancy, it may be our good fortune that he left it unchanged. A.B.P. And now, the story. I met her first when I was 17 and she 15. It was in a dream. No, I did not meet her. I overtook her. It was in a Missourian village which I had never been in before, and was not in at that time, except dream-wise. In the flesh, I was on the Atlantic seaboard, 10 or 1200 miles away. The thing was sudden and without preparation, after the custom of dreams. There I was, crossing a wooden bridge that had a wooden rail, and was untidy with scattered wisps of hay, and there she was, 5 steps in front of me, half a second previously. Neither of us was there. This was the exit of the village, which lay immediately behind us. Its last house was the blacksmith shop, and the peaceful clinking of the hammers, a sound which nearly always seems remote, and is always touched with a spirit of loneliness and a feeling of soft regret for something, you don't know what, was wafted to my ear over my shoulder. In front of us was the winding country road, with woods on one side, and on the other a rail fence, with blackberry vines and hazel bushes crowding its angles. On an upper rail a bluebird, and scurrying toward him along the same rail a fox squirrel, with his tail bent high like a shepherd's crook. Beyond the fence a rich field of grain, and far away a farmer in shirt-sleeves and straw hat, wading knee-deep through it, no other representative of life, and no noise at all, everywhere a Sabbath stillness. I remember it all, and the girl too, and just how she walked, and how she was dressed. In the first moment I was 5 steps behind her, in the next one I was at her side, without either stepping or gliding. It merely happened. The transfer ignored space. I noticed that, but not with any surprise. It seemed a natural process. I was at her side. I put my arm around her waist and drew her close to me, for I loved her, and although I did not know her, my behavior seemed to me quite natural and right, and I had no misgivings about it. She showed no surprise, no distress, no displeasure, but put an arm around my waist and turned up her face to mine with a happy welcome in it, and when I bent down to kiss her, she received the kiss as if she was expecting it, and as if it was quite natural for me to offer it and her to take it and have pleasure in it. The affection which I felt for her and which she manifestly felt for me was a quite simple fact. But the quality of it was another matter. It was not the affection of brother and sister. It was closer than that, more clinging, more endearing, more reverent. It was not the love of sweethearts, for there was no fire in it. It was somewhere between the two, and was finer than either, and more exquisite, more profoundly contenting. We often experience this strange and gracious thing in our dream loves, and we remember it as a feature of our childhood loves, too. We strolled along across the bridge and down the road, chatting like the oldest friends. She called me George, and that seemed natural and right, though it was not my name, and I called her Alice, and she did not correct me, though without a doubt it was not her name. Everything that happened seemed just natural and to be expected. Once I said, "What a dear little hand it is," and without any words she laid it gratefully in mine for me to examine it. I did it, remarking upon its littleness, its delicate beauty, and its satin skin, then kissed it. She put it up to her lips without saying anything, and kissed it in the same place. Around a curve of the road, at the end of half a mile, we came to a log house, and entered it, and found the table set, and everything on it steaming hot. A roast turkey, corn in the ear, buttered beans, and the rest of the usual things, and a cat curled up asleep in the splint-bottomed chair by the fireplace. But no people, just emptiness and silence. She said she would look in the next room if I would wait for her. So I sat down, and she passed through the door, which closed behind her with a click of the latch. I waited and waited. Then I got up and followed, for I could not any longer bear to have her out of my sight. I passed through the door and found myself in a strange sort of cemetery, a city of innumerable tombs and monuments, stretching far and wide on every hand, and flushed with pink and gold lights flung from the sinking sun. I turned around, and the log house was gone. I ran here and there and yonder, down the lanes and between the rows of tombs, calling "Alice," and presently the night closed down, and I could not find my way. Then I woke, in deep distress over my loss, and was in my bed in Philadelphia. And I was not 17 now, but 19. 10 years afterwards, in another dream, I found her. I was 17 again, and she was still 15. I was in a grassy place in the twilight deeps of a magnolia forest, some miles above Natchez, Mississippi. The trees were snowed over with great blossoms, and the air was loaded with their rich and strenuous fragrance. The ground was high, and through a rift in the wood a burnished patch of the river was visible in the distance. I was sitting on the grass, absorbed in thinking, when an arm was laid around my neck, and there was Alice sitting by my side and looking into my face. A deep and satisfied happiness and an unwordable gratitude rose in me, but with it there was no feeling of surprise, and there was no sense of a time lapse. The 10 years amounted to hardly even a yesterday, indeed to hardly even a noticeable fraction of it. We dropped in the tranquillest way into affectionate caressing and pettings, and chatted along without a reference to the separation, which was natural, for I think we did not know there had been any that one might measure with either clock or almanac. She called me Jack, and I called her Helen, and those seemed the right and proper names, and perhaps neither of us suspected that we had ever borne others, or if we did suspect it, it was probably not a matter of consequence. She had been beautiful 10 years before. She was just as beautiful still, girlishly young and sweet and innocent, and she was still that now. She had had blue eyes, a hair of flossy gold before. She had black hair now and dark brown eyes. I noted these differences, but they did not suggest change. To me she was the same girl she was before, absolutely. It never occurred to me to ask what became of the log house. I doubt if I even thought of it. We were living in a simple and natural and beautiful world where everything that happened was natural and right, and was not perplexed with the unexpected or with any forms of surprise, and so there was no occasion for explanations and no interest attaching to such things. We had a dear and pleasant time together, and were like a couple of ignorant and contented children. Helen had a summer hat on. She took it off presently and said, "It was in the way. Now you can kiss me better." It seemed to me merely a bit of courteous and considerate wisdom, nothing more, and a natural thing for her to think of and do. We went wandering through the woods and came to a limpid and shallow stream, a matter of 3 yards wide. She said, "I must not get my feet wet, dear. Carry me over." I took her in my arms and gave her my hat to hold. This was to keep my own feet from getting wet. I did not know why this should have that effect. I merely knew it, and she knew it too. I crossed the stream and said I would go on carrying her, because it was so pleasant. And she said it was pleasant to her too, and wished we had thought of it sooner. It seemed a pity to me that we should have walked so far, both of us on foot, when we could have been having this higher enjoyment, and I spoke of it regretfully as a something lost which could never be got back. She was troubled about it too, and said there must be some way to get it back, and she would think. After musing deeply a little while, she looked up radiant and proud, and said she had found it. Carry me back and start over again. I can see now that that was no solution, but at the time it seemed luminous with intelligence, and I believed that there was not another little head in the world that could have worked out that difficult problem with such swiftness and success. I told her that, and it pleased her, and she said she was glad it all happened, so that I could see how capable she was. After thinking a moment, she added that it was quite atrious. The word seemed to mean something, I do not know why. In fact, it seemed to cover the whole ground and leave nothing more to say. I admired the nice aptness and the flashing felicity of the phrase. It was filled with respect for the marvelous mind that had been able to engender it. I think less of it now. It is a noticeable fact that the intellectual coinage of dreamland often passes for more there than it would fetch here. Many a time in after years my dream sweetheart threw off golden sayings which crumbled to ashes under my pencil when I was setting them down in my notebook after breakfast. I carried her back and started over again, and all the long afternoon I bore her in my arms, mile upon mile, and it never occurred to either of us that there was anything remarkable in a youth like me being able to carry that sweet bundle around half a day without some sense of fatigue or need of rest. There are many dream worlds, but none is so rightly and reasonably and pleasantly arranged as that one. After dark we reached a great plantation house, and it was her home. I carried her in, and the family knew me, and I knew them, although we had not met before, and the mother asked me with ill-disguised anxiety how much 12 times 14 was, and I said 135, and she put it down on a piece of paper, saying it was her habit in the process of perfecting her education not to trust important particulars to her memory. And her husband was offering me a chair, but noticed that Helen was asleep, so he said it would be best not to disturb her, and he backed me softly against a wardrobe and said I could stand more easily now. Then a negro came in, bowing humbly, with his slouch hat in his hand, and asked me if I would have my measure taken. The question did not surprise me, but it confused and worried me, and I said I should like to have advice about it. He started toward the door to call advisers. Then he and the family and the lights began to grow dim, and in a few moments the place was pitch dark, but straightway there came a flood of moonlight and a gust of cold wind, and I found myself crossing a frozen lake, and my arms were empty. The wave of grief that swept through me woke me up, and I was sitting at my desk in the newspaper office in San Francisco, and I noticed by the clock that I had been asleep less than 2 minutes. And what was of more consequence, I was 29 years old. That was 1864. The next year and the year after I had momentary glimpses of my dream sweetheart, but nothing more. These are set down in my notebooks under their proper dates, but with no talks nor other particulars added, which is sufficient evidence to me that there were none to add. In both of these instances there was the sudden meeting and recognition, the eager approach, then the instant disappearance, leaving the world empty and of no worth. I remember the 2 images quite well. In fact, I remember all the images of that spirit, and I can bring them before me without help of my notebook. The habit of writing down my dreams of all sorts while they were fresh in my mind, and then studying them and rehearsing them and trying to find out what the source of dreams is, and which of the 2 or 3 separate persons inhabiting us is their architect, has given me a good dream memory, a thing which is not usual with people, for few drill the dream memory, and no memory can be kept strong without that. I spent a few months in the Hawaiian Islands in 1866, and in October of that year I delivered my maiden lecture. It was in San Francisco. In the following January I arrived in New York and had just completed my 31st year. In that year I saw my Platonic dream sweetheart again. In this dream I was again standing on the stage of the Opera House in San Francisco, ready to lecture, and with the audience vividly individualized before me in the strong light. I begun, spoke a few words, and stopped, cold with fright, for I discovered that I had no subject, no text, nothing to talk about. I choked for a while, then got out a few words, a lame, poor attempt at humor. The house made no response. There was a miserable pause, then another attempt, and another failure. There were a few scornful laughs. Otherwise the house was silent, unsmilingly austere, deeply offended. I was consuming with shame. In my distress I tried to work upon its pity. I began to make servile apologies mixed with gross and ill-timed flatteries, and to beg and plead for forgiveness. This was too much, and the people broke into insulting cries, whistlings, hootings, and catcalls, and in the midst of this they rose and began to struggle in a confused mass toward the door. I stood dazed and helpless, looking out over this spectacle, and thinking how everybody would be talking about it next day, and I could not show myself in the streets. When the house was become wholly empty and still, I sat down on the only chair that was on the stage, and bent my head down on the reading desk to shut out the look of that place. Soon that familiar dream voice spoke my name and swept all my troubles away. "Robert," I answered. "Agnes?" The next moment we 2 were lounging up the blossomy gorge called the Io Valley in the Hawaiian Islands. I recognized without any explanations that Robert was not my name, but only a pet name, a common noun, and meant dear, and both of us knew that Agnes was not a name, but only a pet name, a common name, whose spirit was affectionate, but not conveyable with exactness in any but the dream language. It was about the equivalent of dear, but the dream vocabulary shaves meanings finer and closer than do the world's daytime dictionaries. We did not know why those words should have those meanings. We had used words which had no existence in any known language, and had expected them to be understood, and they were understood. In my notebooks there are several letters from this dream sweetheart in some unknown tongue, presumably dream tongue, with translations added. I should like to be master of that tongue, that I could talk in shorthand. Here is one of those letters, the whole of it. Rax Oha Tau. Translation: When you receive this, it will remind you that I long to see your face and touch your hand for the comfort of it and the peace. It is swifter than waking thought, for thought is not thought at all, but only a vague and formless fog until it is articulated into words. We wandered far up the fairy gorge, gathering the beautiful flowers of the ginger plant and talking affectionate things, and tying and retying each other's ribbons and cravats, which didn't need it, and finally sat down in the shade of a tree and climbed the vine-hung precipices with our eyes up and up and up toward the sky, to where the drifting scarfs of white mist clove them across, and left the green summits floating pale and remote, like spectral islands wandering in the deeps of space, and then we descended to the earth and talked again. How still it is, and soft and balmy and reposeful. I could never tire of it. You like it, don't you, Robert? Yes, and I like the whole region, all the islands. Maui, it is a darling island. I have been here before. Have you? Once, but it wasn't an island then. What was it? It was a Sufa. I understood. It was a dream word for part of a continent. What were the people like? They hadn't come yet. There weren't any. Do you know, Agnes, that is Haikikala, the dead volcano, over there across the valley. Was it here in your friend's time? Yes, but it was burning. Do you travel much? I think so. Not here much, but in the stars a good deal. Is it pretty there? She used a couple of dream words for you will go with me sometime and you will see. Non-committal, as one perceives now, but I did not notice it then. A man of war lit on her shoulder. I put out my hand and caught it. Its feathers began to fall out, and it turned into a kitten. Then the kitten's body began to contract itself to a ball and put out hairy long legs, and soon it was a tarantula. I was going to keep it, but it turned into a starfish, and I threw it away. Agnes said it was not worth while to try to keep things. There was no stability about them. I suggested rocks, but she said a rock was like the rest. It wouldn't stay. She picked up a stone, and it turned into a bat and flew away. These curious matters interested me, but that was all. They did not stir my wonder. While we were sitting there in the Io gorge talking, a Kanaka came along who was wrinkled and bent and white-headed, and he stopped and talked to us in the native tongue, and we understood him without trouble and answered him in his own speech. He said he was 130 years old, and he remembered Captain Cook well and was present when he was murdered, saw it with his own eyes, and also helped. Then he showed us his gun, which was of a strange make, and he said it was his own invention and was to shoot arrows with, though one loaded it with powder, and it had a percussion lock. He said it would carry 100 miles. It seemed a reasonable statement. I had no fault to find with it, and it did not in any way surprise me. He loaded it and fired an arrow aloft, and it darted into the sky and vanished. Then he went his way, saying that the arrow would fall near us in half an hour, and would go many yards into the earth, not minding the rocks. I took the time, and we waited, reclining upon the mossy slant at the base of a tree, and gazing into the sky. By and by there was a hissing sound, followed by a dull impact, and Agnes uttered a groan. She said in a series of fainting gasps, "Take me in your arms. It passed through me. Hold me to your heart. I am afraid to die. Closer, closer. It is growing dark. I cannot see you. Don't leave me. Where are you? You are not gone? You will not leave me?" "I would not leave you." Then her spirit passed. She was clay in my arms. The scene changed in an instant, and I was awake and crossing Bond Street in New York with a friend, and it was snowing hard. We had been talking, and there had been no observable gaps in the conversation. I doubt if I had made any more than 2 steps while I was asleep. I am satisfied that even the most elaborate and incident-crowded dream is seldom more than a few seconds in length. It would not cost me very much of a strain to believe in Mohammed's 70-year dream, which began when he knocked his glass over and ended in time for him to catch it before the water spilled. Within a quarter of an hour I was in my quarters, undressed, ready for bed, and was jotting down my dream in my notebook. A striking thing happened now. I finished my notes, and I was just going to turn out the gas when I was caught with a most strenuous gape, for it was very late, and I was very drowsy. I fell asleep and dreamed again. What now follows occurred while I was asleep, and when I woke again the gape had completed itself, but not long before, I think, for I was still on my feet. I was in Athens, a city which I had not then seen, but I recognized the Parthenon from the pictures, although it had a fresh look and was in perfect repair. I passed by it and climbed a grassy hill toward a palatial sort of mansion which was built of red terracotta and had a spacious portico, whose roof was supported by a rank of fluted columns with Corinthian capitals. It was noonday, but I met no one. I passed into the house and entered the first room. It was very large and light. Its walls were of polished and richly tinted and veined onyx, and its floor was a pictured pattern in soft colors laid in tiles. I noted the details of the furniture and the ornaments, a thing which I should not have been likely to do when awake, and they took sharp hold and remained in my memory. They are not really dim yet, and this was more than 30 years ago. There was a person present, Agnes. I was not surprised to see her, but only glad. She was in the simple Greek costume, and her hair and eyes were different as to color from those she had had when she died in the Hawaiian Islands half an hour before. But to me she was exactly her own beautiful little self, as I had always known her, and she was still 15, and I was 17 once more. She was sitting on an ivory settee, crocheting something or other, and had her crewels in a shallow willow work-basket in her lap. I sat down by her, and we began to chat in the usual way. I remembered her death, but the pain and the grief and the bitterness which had been so sharp and so desolating to me at the moment that it happened had wholly passed from me now, and had left not a scar. I was grateful to have her back, but there was no realizable sense that she had ever been gone, and so it did not occur to me to speak about it, and she made no reference to it herself. It may be that she had often died before, and knew that there was nothing lasting about it, and consequently nothing important enough in it to make conversation out of. When I think of that house and its belongings, I recognize what a master in taste and drawing and color and arrangement is the dream artist who resides in us. In my waking hours, when the inferior artist in me is in command, I cannot draw even the simplest picture with a pencil, nor do anything with a brush and colors. I cannot bring before my mind's eye the detailed image of any building known to me except my own house at home, of St. Paul's, St. Peter's, the Eiffel Tower, the Taj, the Capitol of Washington. I can reproduce only portions, partial glimpses. The same with Niagara Falls and the Matterhorn and other familiar things in nature. I cannot bring before my mind's eye the face or figure of any human being known to me. I have seen my family at breakfast within the past 2 hours. I cannot bring their images before me. I do not know how they look. Before me, as I write, I see a little grove of young trees in the garden. High above them projects the slender lance of a young pine. Beyond it is a glimpse of the upper half of a dull white chimney covered by an A-shaped little roof shingled with brown-red tiles. And half a mile away is a hilltop densely wooded, and the red is cloven by a curved, wide vacancy, which is smooth and grass-clad. I cannot shut my eyes and reproduce that picture as a whole at all, nor any single detail of it, except the grassy curve, and that but vaguely and fleetingly. But my dream artist can draw anything, and do it perfectly. He can paint with all the colors and all the shades, and do it with delicacy and truth. He can place before me vivid images of palaces, cities, hamlets, hovels, mountains, valleys, lakes, skies glowing in sunlight or moonlight, or veiled in driving gusts of snow or rain, and he can set before me people who are intensely alive and who feel and express their feelings in their faces, and who also talk and laugh, sing and swear. And when I wake, I can shut my eyes and bring back those people and the scenery and the buildings, and not only in general view, but often in nice detail. While Agnes and I sat talking in that grand Athens house, several stately Greeks entered from another part of it, disputing warmly about something or other, and passed us by with courteous recognition, and among them was Socrates. I recognized him by his nose. A moment later, the house and Agnes and Athens vanished away, and I was in my quarters in New York again and reaching for my notebook. In our dreams, I know it, we do make the journeys we seem to make. We do see the things we seem to see. The people, the horses, the cats, the dogs, the birds, the whales are real, not chimeras. They are living spirits, not shadows, and they are immortal and indestructible. They go whither they will. They visit all resorts, all points of interest, even the twinkling suns that wander in the wastes of space. That is where those strange mountains are, which slide from under our feet while we walk, and where those vast caverns are, whose bewildering avenues close behind us and in front when we are lost and shut us in. We know this because there are no such things here, and they must be there because there is no other place. This tale is long enough, and I will close it now. In the 44 years that I have known my dreamland sweetheart, I have seen her once in 2 years on an average. Mainly these were glimpses, but she was always immediately recognizable, notwithstanding that she was given to repairing herself and getting up doubtful improvements in her hair and eyes. She was always 15 and looked it and acted it, and I was always 17 and never felt a day older. To me, she is a real person, not a fiction, and her sweet and innocent society has been one of the prettiest and pleasantest experiences of my life. I know that to you her talk will not seem of first intellectual order, but you should hear her in dreamland. Then you would see. I saw her a week ago, just for a moment, 15 as usual, and I 17, instead of going on 63 as I was when I went to sleep. We were in India, and Bombay was in sight, also Windsor Castle, its towers and battlements veiled in a delicate haze, and from it the Thames flowed, curving and winding between its swarded banks to our feet. I said, "There is no question about it. England is the most beautiful of all the countries." Her face lighted with approval, and she said, with that sweet and earnest irrelevance of hers, "It is, because it is so marginal." Then she disappeared. It was just as well. She could probably have added nothing to that rounded and perfect statement without damaging its symmetry. This glimpse of her carries me back to Maui and that time when I saw her gasp out her young life. That was a terrible thing to me at the time. It was preternaturally vivid, and the pain and the grief and the misery of it, to me, transcended many sufferings that I have known in waking life. For everything in a dream is more deep and strong and sharp and real than is ever its pale imitation in the unreal life which is ours when we go about awake and clothed with our artificial selves in this vague and dull-tinted artificial world. When we die, we shall slough off this cheap intellect, perhaps, and go abroad into dreamland, clothed in our real selves, and aggrandized and enriched by the command over the mysterious mental magician who is here not our slave, but only our guest. End of My Platonic Sweetheart by Mark Twain, Read for you by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in December 2019.
The City of My Dreams by Theodore Dreiser. Read for Dreams Collection 1, Stories and Poems by Phil Schempf. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The City of My Dreams by Theodore Dreiser. It was silent, the city of my dreams, marble and serene, due perhaps to the fact that in reality I knew nothing of crowds, poverty, the winds and storms of the inadequate that blow like dust along the paths of life. It was an amazing city, so far-flung, so beautiful, so dead. There were tracks of iron stalking through the air, and streets that were as canyons, and stairways that mounted in vast flights to noble plazas, and steps that led down into deep places, where were, strangely enough, underworld silences. And there were parks and flowers and rivers. And then, after 20 years, here it stood, as amazing almost as my dream, save that in the waking the flush of life was over it. It possessed the tang of contests and dreams and enthusiasms and delights, and terrors and despairs. Through its ways and canyons and open spaces and underground passages were running, seething, sparkling, darkling, a mass of beings such as my dream city never knew. The thing that interested me then as now about New York, as indeed about any great city, but more definitely New York, because it was and is so preponderantly large, was the sharp and at the same time immense contrast it showed between the dull and the shrewd, the strong and the weak, the rich and the poor, the wise and the ignorant. This perhaps was more by reason of numbers and opportunity than anything else, for of course humanity is much the same everywhere. But the number from which to choose was so great here that the strong, or those who ultimately dominated, were so very strong, and the weak so very, very weak, and so very, very many. I once knew a poor, half-demented, and very much shriveled little seamstress, who occupied a tiny hall bedroom in a side-street rooming-house, cooked her meals on a small alcohol stove set on a bureau, and who had about space enough outside of this to take 3 good steps either way. I would rather live in my hall bedroom in New York than in any 15-room house in the country that I ever saw, she commented once, and her poor little colourless eyes held more of a sparkle and snap in them than I ever saw there, before or after. She was wont to add to her sewing income by reading fortunes in cards and tea leaves and coffee grounds, telling of love and prosperity to scores as lowly as herself, who would never see either. The colour and noise and splendour of the city as a spectacle was sufficient to pay her for all her ills. And have I not felt the glamour of it myself, and do I not still? Broadway, at 42nd Street, on those self-same spring evenings when the city is crowded with an idle sight-seeing cloud of Westerners, when the doors of all shops are open, the windows of nearly all restaurants wide to the gaze of the idle passer-by. Here is the great city, and it is lush and dreamy. A May or June moon will be hanging like a burnished silver disk between the high walls aloft. 100, 1,000 electric signs will blink and wink, and the floods of citizens and visitors in summer clothes and with gay hats, the street-cars jouncing their endless carloads on indifferent errands, the taxis and private cars fluttering about like jeweled flies. The very gasoline contributes a distinct perfume. Life bubbles, sparkles, chatters gay, incoherent stuff. Such is Broadway. And then 5th Avenue, that singing crystal street, on a shopping afternoon, winter, summer, spring, or fall. What tells you as sharply of spring when, its windows crowded with delicate effronteries of silks and gay nothings of all description, it greets you in January, February, and March? And how, as early as November again, it sings of Palm Beach and Newport and the lesser or greater joys of the tropics and the warmer seas? And in September, how the haughty display of furs and rugs in this same avenue, and costumes de luxe for ball and dinner, cry out of snows and blizzards, when you are scarcely 10 days back from mountain or seaside. One might think, from the picture presented and the residences which line the upper section, that all the world was inordinately prosperous and exclusive and happy. And yet, if you but knew the tawdry underbrush of society, the tangle and mat of futile growth between the tall trees of success, the shabby chambers crowded with aspirants and climbers, the immense mansions barren of a single social affair, perfect and silent. I often think of the vast mass of underlings, boys and girls, who with nothing but their youth and their ambitions to commend them, are daily and hourly setting their faces New Yorkward, reconnoitering the city for what it may hold in the shape of wealth or fame, or, if not that, position and comfort in the future, and what, if anything, they will reap. Ah, their young eyes drinking in its promise. And then again, I think of all the powerful or semi-powerful men and women throughout the world toiling at one task or another, a store, a mine, a bank, a profession, somewhere outside of New York, whose one ambition is to reach the place where their wealth will permit them to enter and remain in New York, dominant above the mass, luxuriating in what they consider luxury. The illusion of it, the hypnosis deep and moving that it is, how the strong and the weak, the wise and the fools, the greedy of heart and of eye, seek the nepenthe, the lethe of its something hugeness. I always marvel at those who are willing, seemingly, to pay any price, the price, whatever it may be, for one sip of this poison cup. What a stinging, quivering zest they display! How beauty is willing to sell its bloom, virtue its last rag, strength an almost usurious portion of that which it controls, youth its very best years, its hope or dream of fame, fame and power their dignity and presence, age its weary hours, to secure but a minor part of all this, a taste of its vibrating presence and the picture that it makes. Can you not hear them almost singing its praises? End of The City of My Dreams by Theodore Dreiser.
Dreams Are Best by Robert W. Service. Read for Dreams Collection 1, Stories and Poems by Nemo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dreams Are Best by Robert W. Service. I just think that dreams are best, just to sit and fancy things. Give your gold no acid test, try not how your silver rings. Fancy women pure and good, fancy men upright and true. Fortressed in your solitude, let life be a dream to you. For I think that thought is all, truth's a minion of the mind. Love's ideal comes at call, as ye seek, so shall ye find. But ye must not seek too far, things are never what they seem. Let a star be just a star, and a woman just a dream. O you dreamers proud and pure, you have gleaned the sweet of life, golden truths that shall endure over pain and doubt and strife. I would rather be a fool living in my paradise than the leader of a school, sadly sane and weary wise. O you cynics with your sneers, fallen brains and hearts of brass, tweak me by my foolish ears, write me down a simple ass. I'll believe the real you is the you without a taint. I'll believe each woman, too, but a slightly damaged saint. Yes, I'll smoke my cigarette, vestured in my garb of dreams, and I'll borrow no regret. All is gold that golden gleams. So I'll charm my solitude with the faith that life is blessed, brave and noble, bright and good. Oh, I think that dreams are best. End of Dreams Are Best by Robert W. Service.
Nightmare by Clark Ashton Smith. Recorded for Dreams Collection 1, Stories and Poems by Newgatenovelist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Nightmare by Clark Ashton Smith. As though 1,000 vampires, from the day fleeing unseen, oppressed that nightly deep, the straightening and darkened skies of sleep closed on the dreamland dale in which I lay. Eternal tensions numbed the wings of time, while through the unending narrow ways I sought awakening, up precipitous gloom I thought to reach, the dawn far pinnacled sublime. Rejected at the closen gates of light I turned, and down new dreams and shadows fled, where beetling shapes of veiled, colossal dread, with Gothic wings enormous, arched the night. End of Nightmare by Clark Ashton Smith.
The Dream of Akinosuke by Lafcadio Hearn. Recorded for Dreams Collection 1, Stories and Poems by Steve Mayer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dream of Akinosuke by Lafcadio Hearn. In the district called Toichi of Yamato Province, there used to live a goshi named Miyata Akinosuke. Here I must tell you that in Japanese feudal times there was a privileged class of soldier farmers, freeholders, corresponding to the class of yeomen in England, and these were called goshi. In Akinosuke's garden there was a great and ancient cedar tree, under which he was wont to rest on sultry days. One very warm afternoon he was sitting under the tree with two of his friends, fellow goshi, chatting and drinking wine, when he felt all of a sudden very drowsy, so drowsy that he begged his friends to excuse him for taking a nap in their presence. Then he lay down at the foot of the tree and dreamed this dream. He thought that as he was lying there in his garden he saw a procession, like the train of some great daimyo descending a hill nearby, and that he got up to look at it. A very grand procession it proved to be, more imposing than anything of the kind which he had ever seen before, and it was advancing toward his dwelling. He observed in the van of it a number of young men richly apparelled, who were drawing a great lacquered palace carriage, or goshu guruma, hung with bright blue silk. When the procession arrived within a short distance of the house it halted, and a richly dressed man, evidently a person of rank, advanced from it, approached Akinosuke, bowed to him profoundly, and then said, "Honored sir, you see before you a kerai, vassal of the Kokuo of Tokoyo. My master the king commands me to greet you in his august name, and to place myself wholly at your disposal. He also bids me inform you that he augustly desires your presence at the palace. Be therefore pleased immediately to enter this honorable carriage, which he has sent for your conveyance." Upon hearing these words, Akinosuke wanted to make some fitting reply, But he was too much astonished and embarrassed for speech. And in that same moment his will seemed to melt away from him, so that he could only do as the Kerai bade him. He entered the carriage. The Kerai took a place beside him and made a signal. The drawers, seizing the silken ropes, turned the great vehicle southward, and the journey began. In a very short time, to Akinosuke's amazement, the carriage stopped in front of a huge 2-storied gateway, romon, of a Chinese style, which he had never before seen. Here the Kerai dismounted, saying, "I go to announce the honorable arrival," and he disappeared. After some little waiting, Akinosuke saw 2 noble-looking men, wearing robes of purple silk and high caps of the form indicating lofty rank, come from the gateway. These, after having respectfully saluted him, helped him to descend from the carriage, and led him to the great gate across a vast garden to the entrance of a palace whose front appeared to extend, west and east, to a distance of miles. Akinosuke was then shown into a reception-room of wonderful size and splendor. His guides conducted him to the place of honor, and respectfully seated themselves apart, while serving-maids in costume of ceremony brought refreshments. When Akinosuke had partaken of the refreshments, the 2 purple-robed attendants bowed low before him, and addressed him in the following words, each speaking alternately according to the etiquette of courts. "It's now our honorable duty to inform you as to the reason of your having been summoned hither. Our master the king augustly desires that you become his son-in-law, and it is his wish and command that you shall wed this very day the august princess, his maiden daughter. We shall soon conduct you to the presence chamber, where his augustness even now is waiting to receive you. But it will be necessary that we first invest you with the appropriate garments of ceremony." Having thus spoken, the attendants rose together, and proceeded to an alcove containing a great chest of gold lacquer. They opened the chest, and took from it various robes and girdles of rich material, and a kamuri or regal headdress. With these they attired Akinosuke as befitted a princely bridegroom, and he was then conducted to the presence room, where he saw the Kokuo of Tokoyo seated upon the daiza, wearing a high black cap of state, and robed in robes of yellow silk. Before the daiza, to left and right, a multitude of dignitaries sat in rank, motionless and splendid as images in a temple, and Akinosuke, advancing into their midst, saluted the king with the triple prostration of usage. The king greeted him with gracious words, and then said, "You have already been informed as to the reason of your having been summoned to our presence. We have decided that you shall become the adopted husband of our only daughter, and the wedding ceremony shall now be performed." As the king finished speaking, a sound of joyful music was heard, and a long train of beautiful court ladies advanced from behind a curtain to conduct Akinosuke to the room in which the bride awaited him. The room was immense, but it could scarcely contain the multitude of guests assembled to witness the wedding ceremony. All bowed down before Akinosuke as he took his place facing the king's daughter on the kneeling cushion prepared for him. As a maiden of heaven the bride appeared to be, and her robes were beautiful as a summer sky, and the marriage was performed amid great rejoicing. Afterwards the pair were conducted to a suite of apartments that had been prepared for them in another portion of the palace, and there they received the congratulations of many noble persons, and wedding gifts beyond counting. Some days later Akinosuke was again summoned to the throne-room. On this occasion he was received even more graciously than before, and the king said to him, "In the southwestern part of our dominion there is an island called Raishu. We have now appointed you governor of that island. You will find the people loyal and docile, but their laws have not yet been brought into proper accord with the laws of Tokoyo, and their customs have not been properly regulated. We entrust you with the duty of improving their social condition as far as may be possible, and we desire that you shall rule them with kindness and wisdom. All preparations necessary for your journey to Raishu have already been made." So Akinosuke and his bride departed from the palace of Tokoyo, accompanied to the shore by a great escort of nobles and officials, and they embarked upon a ship of state provided by the king, and with favoring winds they safely sailed to Raishu, and found the good people of that island assembled upon the beach to welcome them. Akinosuke entered at once upon his new duties, and they did not prove to be hard. During the first 3 years of his governorship he was occupied chiefly with the framing and the enactment of laws, but he had wise counselors to help him, and he never found the work unpleasant. When it was all finished, he had no active duties to perform, beyond attending the rites and ceremonies ordained by ancient custom. The country was so healthy and so fertile that sickness and want were unknown, and the people were so good that no laws were ever broken. And Akinosuke dwelt and ruled in Raishu for 20 years more, making in all 23 years of sojourn, during which no shadow of sorrow traversed his life. But in the 24th year of his governorship a great misfortune came upon him, for his wife, who had borne him 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls, fell sick and died. She was buried with high pomp on the summit of a beautiful hill in the district of Hanryoko, and a monument exceedingly splendid was placed upon her grave. But Akinosuke felt such grief at her death that he no longer cared to live. Now when the legal period of mourning was over, there came to Raishu from the Tokoyo palace a shisha, or royal messenger. The shisha delivered to Akinosuke a message of condolence, and then said to him, "These are the words which our august master, the king of Tokoyo, commands that I repeat to you. We will now send you back to your own people and country. As for the 7 children, they are the grandsons and granddaughters of the king, and shall be fitly cared for. Do not therefore allow your mind to be troubled concerning them." On receiving this mandate, Akinosuke submissively prepared for his departure. When all his affairs had been settled, and the ceremony of bidding farewell to his counselors and trusted officials had been concluded, he was escorted with much honor to the port. There he embarked upon the ship sent for him, and the ship sailed out into the blue sea, under the blue sky, and the shape of the island of Raishu itself turned blue, and then turned gray, and then vanished forever. And Akinosuke suddenly awoke, under the cedar tree in his own garden. For a moment he was stupefied and dazed, but he perceived his 2 friends still seated near him, drinking and chatting merrily. He stared at them in a bewildered way and cried aloud, "How strange!" "Akinosuke must have been dreaming," one of them exclaimed with a laugh. "What did you see, Akinosuke, that was strange?" Then Akinosuke told his dream, that dream of 23 years' sojourn in the realm of Tokoyo, in the island of Raishu, and they were astonished, because he had rarely slept for no more than a few minutes. One Goshi said, "Indeed, you saw strange things. We also saw something strange while you were napping. A little yellow butterfly was fluttering over your face for a moment or two, and we watched it. Then it alighted on the ground beside you, close to the tree, and almost as soon as it alighted there, a big ant came out of a hole and seized it and pulled it down into the hole. Just before you woke up, we saw that very butterfly come out of the hole again and flutter over your face as before, and then it suddenly disappeared. We do not know where it went." "Perhaps it was Akinosuke's soul," the other Goshi said. "Certainly I thought I saw it fly into his mouth. But even if that butterfly was Akinosuke's soul, the fact would not explain his dream." "The ants might explain it," returned the first speaker. "Ants are queer beings, possibly goblins. Anyhow, there's a big ant's nest under that cedar tree." "Let us look," cried Akinosuke, greatly moved by this suggestion, and he went for a spade. The ground about and beneath the cedar tree proved to have been excavated in a most surprising way by a prodigious colony of ants. The ants had furthermore built inside their excavations, and their tiny constructions of straw, clay, and stems bore an odd resemblance to miniature towns. In the middle of a structure considerably larger than the rest, there was a marvelous swarming of small ants around the body of one very big ant, which had yellowish wings and a long black head. "Why, there's the king of my dream!" cried Akinosuke. "And there is the palace of Tokoyo. How extraordinary! Raishu ought to lie somewhere southwest of it, to the left of that big root. Yes, here it is! How very strange! Now I'm sure I can find the mountain of Hanryoko and the grave of the princess." In the wreck of the nest he searched and searched, and at last discovered a tiny mound, on the top of which was fixed a water-worn pebble, in shape resembling a Buddhist monument. Underneath it he found, embedded in clay, the dead body of a female ant. End of The Dream of Akinosuke by Lafcadio Hearn.
Miss Cubbidge and the Dragon of Romance by Lord Dunsany. Recorded for Dreams, Collection 1, Stories and Poems by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in January 2020. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Miss Cubbidge and the Dragon of Romance by Lord Dunsany. This tale is told in the balconies of Belgrave Square and among the towers of Pont Street. Men sing it at evening in the Brompton Road. Little upon her 18th birthday, thought Miss Cubbidge of No. 12A Prince of Wales Square, that before another year had gone its way, she would lose sight of that unshapely oblong that was so long her home. And had you told her further that within that year all trace of that so-called square, and of the day when her father was elected by a thumping majority to share in the guidance of the destinies of the empire, should utterly fade from her memory, she would merely have said in that affected voice of hers, "Go on." There was nothing about it in the daily press. The policy of her father's party had no provision for it. There was no hint of it in conversation at evening parties to which Miss Cubbidge went. There was nothing to warn her at all that a loathsome dragon with golden scales that rattled as he went should have come up clean out of the prime of romance, and gone by night, so far as we know, through Hammersmith, and come to Ardell Mansions, and then had turned to his left, which of course brought him to Miss Cubbidge's father's house. There sat Miss Cubbidge at evening on her balcony, quite alone, waiting for her father to be made a baronet. She was wearing walking boots and a hat and a low-necked evening dress, for a painter was but just now painting her portrait, and neither she nor the painter saw anything odd in the strange combination. She did not notice the roar of the dragon's golden scales, nor distinguish above the manifold lights of London the small red glare of his eyes. He suddenly lifted his head, a blaze of gold, over the balcony. He did not appear a yellow dragon then, for his glistening scales reflected the beauty that London puts upon her only at evening and night. She screamed, but to no knight, nor knew what knight to call upon, nor guessed where the dragon's overthrowers of far romantic days, nor what mightier game they chased, or what wars they waged. Perchance they were busy even then arming for Armageddon. Out of the balcony of her father's house in Prince of Wales Square, the painted dark green balcony that grew blacker every year, the dragon lifted Miss Cubbidge and spread his rattling wings, and London fell away like an old fashion. And England fell away, and the smoke of its factories, and the round material world that goes humming round the sun, vexed and pursued by time, until there appeared the eternal and ancient lands of romance, lying low by mystical seas. You had not pictured Miss Cubbidge stroking the golden head of one of the dragons of song with one hand idly, while with the other she sometimes played with pearls brought up from lonely places of the sea. They filled huge haliotis shells with pearls and laid them there beside her. They brought her emeralds, which she set to flash among the tresses of her long black hair. They brought her threaded sapphires for her cloak. All this the princess of fable did, and the elves and the gnomes of myth. And partly she still lived, and partly she was one with long ago, and with those sacred tales that nurses tell, when all their children are good, and evening has come, and the fire is burning well, and the soft pat-pat of the snowflakes on the pane is like the furtive tread of fearful things in old enchanted woods. If at first she missed those dainty novelties among which she was reared, the old sufficient song of the mystical sea, singing of fairy lore, at first soothed and at last consoled her. Even she forgot those advertisements of pills that are so dear to England. Even she forgot political cant, and the things that one discusses and the things that one does not. and had perforce to content herself with seeing sailing by huge golden-laden galleons with treasure for Madrid, and the merry skull and crossbones of pirateers, and the tiny Nautilus setting out to sea, and ships of heroes trafficking in romance, or of princes seeking for enchanted isles. It was not by chains that the dragon kept her there, but by one of the spells of old. To one to whom the facilities of the daily press had for so long been accorded spells would have paled, you would have said, and galleons after a time, and all things out of date. After a time, but whether the centuries passed her, or whether the years, or whether no time at all, she did not know. If anything indicated the passing of time, it was the rhythm of elfin horns blowing upon the heights. If the centuries went by her, the spell that bound her gave her also perennial youth, and kept alight forever the lantern by her side, and saved from decay the marble palace facing the mystical sea. And if no time went by her at all, her single moment on those marvelous coasts was turned, as it were, to a crystal, reflecting 1,000 scenes. If it was all a dream, it was a dream that knew no morning and no fading away. The tide roamed on and whispered of mastery and of myth, while near that captive lady, asleep in his marble tank, the golden dragon dreamed, and a little way out from the coast, all that the dragon dreamed showed faintly in the mist that lay over the sea. He never dreamed of any rescuing night. So long as he dreamed, it was twilight. But when he came up nimbly out of his tank, night fell, and starlight glistened on the dripping golden scales. There he and his captive either defeated time or never encountered him at all, while in the world we know raged Roncesvalles, or battles yet to be. I know not to what part of the shore of romance he bore her. Perhaps she became one of those princesses of whom fable loves to tell, but let it suffice that there she lived by the sea, and kings ruled, and demons ruled, and kings came again, and many cities returned to their native dust, and still she abided there, and still her marble palace passed not away, nor the power that there was in the dragon's spell. And only once did there ever come to her a message from the world that of old she knew. It came in a pearly ship across the mystical sea. It was from an old school friend that she had had in Putney. Merely a note, no more, in a little neat round hand. It said, "It is not proper for you to be there alone." End of Miss Cubbidge and the Dragon of Romance by Lord Dunsany.
My Nightmare by John James Piatt. Recorded for Dreams Collection 1, Stories and Poems, by Newgatenovelist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Nightmare by John James Piatt. All day my nightmare in my thought I keep, spellbound, it seemed, by some magician's charm. A giant slumbered on my slothful arm. His great, slow breathings jarred the land of sleep, like far-off thunder, rumbling low and deep. Lifting his brawny bosom, bronzed and warm, when lo! A voice shook me with stern alarm. "Who art thou here, that dost not sow nor reap? Behold the sleeping servant of thy day, arouse him to thy deed. If thou but break his slumberous spell, awake he will obey." I lifted up my voice and cried, "Awake!" And I awoke. My arm, unnerved, lay dead, a useless thing beneath my sleeping head. My birthday, 1863. End of My Nightmare by John James Piatt.
The Dream of a Ridiculous Man by Fyodor Dostoyevsky, recorded for Dreams Collection No. 1, Stories and Poems. Recorded by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dream of a Ridiculous Man by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Part 1. I am a ridiculous person. Now they call me a madman. That would be a promotion if it were not that I remain as ridiculous in their eyes as before. But now I do not resent it. They are all dear to me now, even when they laugh at me. And indeed, it is just then that they are particularly dear to me. I could join in their laughter, not exactly at myself, but through affection for them, if I did not feel so sad as I look at them. Sad because they do not know the truth, and I do know it. Oh, how hard it is to be the only one who knows the truth. But they won't understand that. No, they won't understand it. In old days, I used to be miserable at seeming ridiculous. Not seeming, but being. I have always been ridiculous, and I have known it, perhaps from the hour I was born. Perhaps from the time I was 7 years old, I knew I was ridiculous. Afterwards, I went to school, studied at the university, and, do you know, the more I learned, the more thoroughly I understood that I was ridiculous. So that it seemed in the end as though all the sciences I studied at the university existed only to prove and make evident to me, as I went more deeply into them, that I was ridiculous. It was the same with life as it was with science. With every year, the same consciousness of the ridiculous figure I cut in every relation grew and strengthened. Everyone always laughed at me, but not one of them knew or guessed that if there were one man on earth who knew better than anybody else that I was absurd, it was myself. And what I resented most of all was that they did not know that. But that was my own fault. I was so proud that nothing would have ever induced me to tell it to anyone. The pride grew in me with the years, and if it had happened that I allowed myself to confess to anyone that I was ridiculous, I believe that I should have blown out my brains the same evening. Oh, how I suffered in my early youth from the fear that I might give way and confess it to my schoolfellows. But since I grew to manhood, I have for some unknown reason become calmer, though I realize my awful characteristic more fully every year. I say unknown, for to this day I cannot tell why it was. Perhaps it was owing to the terrible misery that was growing in my soul through something which was of more consequence than anything else about me. That something was the conviction that had come upon me that nothing in the world mattered. I had long had an inkling of it, but the full realization came last year almost suddenly. I suddenly felt that it was all the same to me whether the world existed or whether there had never been anything at all. I began to feel with all my being that there was nothing existing. At first I fancied that many things had existed in the past, but afterwards I guessed that there never had been anything in the past either, but that it had only seemed so for some reason. Little by little, I guessed that there would be nothing in the future either. Then I left off being angry with people and almost ceased to notice them. Indeed, this showed itself even in the pettiest trifles. I used, for instance, to knock against people in the street, and not so much from being lost in thought. What had I to think about? I had almost given up thinking by that time. Nothing mattered to me. If at least I had solved my problems. Oh, I had not settled one of them, and how many of them they were. But I gave up caring about anything, and all the problems disappeared. And it was after that that I found out the truth. I learnt the truth last November, on the 3rd of November to be precise, and I remember every instant since. It was a gloomy evening, one of the gloomiest possible evenings. I was going home at about 11 o'clock, and I remember that I thought that the evening could not be gloomier, even physically. Rain had been falling all day, and it had been a cold, gloomy, almost menacing rain, with, I remember, an unmistakable spite against mankind. Suddenly, between 10 and 11, it had stopped, and it was followed by a horrible dampness, colder and damper than the rain, and a sort of steam was rising from everything, from every stone in the street, from every by-lane, if one looked down it as far as one could. A thought suddenly occurred to me that if all the street lamps had been put out, it would have been less cheerless, that the gas made one's heart sadder because it lighted it all up. I had had scarcely any dinner that day, and had been spending the evening with an engineer, and 2 other friends had been there also. I sat silent. I fancy I bored them. They talked of something rousing, and suddenly they got excited over it. But they did not really care, I could see that, and only made a show of being excited. I suddenly said as much to them. "My friends," I said, "you really do not care one way or the other." They were not offended, but they all laughed at me. That was because I spoke without any note of reproach, simply because it did not matter to me. They saw it did not, and it amused them. As I was thinking about the gas lamps in the street, I looked up at the sky. The sky was horribly dark, but one could distinctly see tattered clouds, and between them fathomless black patches. Suddenly I noticed in one of these patches a star, and began watching it intently. That was because that star gave me an idea. I decided to kill myself that night. I had firmly determined to do so 2 months before, and, poor as I was, I bought a splendid revolver that very day and loaded it. But 2 months had passed, and it was still lying in my drawer. I was so utterly indifferent that I wanted to seize a moment when I could not be so indifferent. Why, I don't know. And so, for 2 months, every night that I came home, I thought I would shoot myself. I kept waiting for the right moment. And so now this star gave me a thought. I made up my mind that it should certainly be that night. And why the star gave me the thought, I don't know. And just as I was looking at the sky, this little girl took me by the elbow. The street was empty, and there was scarcely anyone to be seen. A cabman was sleeping in the distance in his cab. It was a child of 8 with a kerchief on her head, wearing nothing but a wretched little dress all soaked with rain. But I noticed particularly her wet, broken shoes, and I recall them now. They caught my eye particularly. She suddenly pulled me by the elbow and called me. She was not weeping, but was spasmodically crying out some words which she could not utter properly because she was shivering and shuddering all over. She was in terror about something and kept crying, "Mammy, Mammy." I turned facing her. I did not say a word and went on. But she ran, pulling at me, and there was a note in her voice which in frightened children means despair. I know that sound. Though she did not articulate the words, I understood that her mother was dying, or that something of the sort was happening to them, and that she had run out to call someone, to find something to help her mother. I did not go with her. On the contrary, I had an impulse to drive her away. I told her first to go to a policeman. But clasping her hands, she ran beside me, sobbing and gasping, and would not leave me. Then I stamped my foot and shouted at her. She called out, "Sir, sir," but suddenly abandoned me and rushed headlong across the road. Some other passer-by appeared there, and she evidently flew from me to him. I mounted up to my 5th story. I have a room in a flat where there are other lodgers. My room is small and poor, with a garret window in the shape of a semicircle. I have a sofa covered with American leather, a table with books on it, 2 chairs, and a comfortable armchair as old can be, but of the good old-fashioned shape. I sat down, lighted the candle, and began thinking. In the room next to mine, through the partition wall, a perfect bedlam was going on. It had been going on for the last 3 days. A retired captain lived there, and he had half a dozen visitors, gentlemen of doubtful reputation, drinking vodka and playing stoss with old cards. The night before, there had been a fight, and I know that 2 of them had been for a long time engaged in dragging each other about by the hair. The landlady wanted to complain, but she was in abject terror of the captain. There was only one other lodger in the flat, a thin little regimental lady on a visit to Petersburg, with 3 little children who had been taken ill since they had come into the lodgings. Both she and her children were in mortal fear of the captain, and lay trembling and crossing themselves all night. And the youngest child had a sort of fit from fright. That captain, I know for a fact, sometimes stops people in the Nevsky Prospect and begs. They won't take him into the service, but strange to say, that's why I'm telling this, all this month that the captain has been here, his behavior has caused me no annoyance. I have, of course, tried to avoid his acquaintance from the very beginning, and he, too, was bored with me from the first. But I never care how much they shout the other side of the partition, nor how many of them there are in there. I sit up all night and forget them so completely that I do not even hear them. I stay awake till daybreak, and have been going on like that for the last year. I sit up all night in my armchair at the table, doing nothing. I only read by day. I sit, don't even think. Ideas of a sort wander through my mind, and I let them come and go as they will. A whole candle is burnt every night. I sat down very quietly at the table, took out the revolver, and put it down before me. When I had put it down, I asked myself, I remember, "Is that so?" and answered with complete conviction, "It is." That is, I shall shoot myself. I knew that I should shoot myself that night for certain, but how much longer I should go on sitting at the table I did not know. And no doubt I should have shot myself if it had not been for that little girl. Section 2. You see, though nothing mattered to me, I could feel pain, for instance. If anyone had struck me, it would have hurt me. It was the same morally. If anything very pathetic happened, I should have felt pity just as I used to in old days when there were things in my life that did matter to me. I had felt pity that evening. I should have certainly helped the child. Why, then, had I not helped the little girl? Because of an idea that occurred to me at the time. When she was calling and pulling at me, a question suddenly arose before me, and I could not settle it. The question was an idle one, but I was vexed. I was vexed at the reflection that if I were going to make an end of myself that night, nothing in life ought to have mattered to me. Why was it that all at once I did not feel that nothing mattered, and was sorry for the little girl? I remember that I was very sorry for her, so much so that I felt a strange pang, quite incongruous in my position. Really, I do not know better how to convey my fleeting sensation at the moment, but the sensation persisted at home when I was sitting at the table, and I was very much irritated, as I had not been for a long time past. One reflection followed another. I saw clearly that so long as I was still a human being and not nothingness, I was alive, and so could suffer, be angry, and feel shame at my actions. So be it. But if I'm going to kill myself in 2 hours, say, what is the little girl to me, and what have I to do with shame or with anything else in the world? I shall turn into nothing, absolutely nothing. And can it really be true that the consciousness that I shall completely cease to exist immediately, and so everything else will cease to exist, does not in the least affect my feeling of pity for the child, nor the feeling of shame after a contemptible action? I stamped and shouted at the unhappy child, as though to say, not only I feel no pity, but even if I behave inhumanly and contemptibly, I am free to, for in another 2 hours everything will be extinguished. Do you believe that that was why I shouted that? I am almost convinced of it now. It seemed clear to me that life and the world somehow depended upon me now. I may almost say that the world now seemed created for me alone. If I shot myself, the world would cease to be, at least for me. I say nothing of its being likely that nothing will exist for anyone when I am gone, and that as soon as my consciousness is extinguished, the whole world will vanish too and become void like a phantom, as a mere appurtenance of my consciousness, for possibly all this world and all these people are only me myself. I remember that as I sat and reflected, I turned all these new questions that swarmed one after another quite the other way, and thought of something quite new. For instance, a strange reflection suddenly occurred to me that if I had lived before on the moon or on Mars, and there had committed the most disgraceful and dishonorable action, and had there been put to such shame and ignominy as one can only conceive and realize in dreams, in nightmares, and if finding myself afterwards on earth, I were able to retain the memory of what I had done on the other planet, and at the same time knew that I should never, under any circumstances, return there, then looking from the earth to the moon, should I care or not? Should I feel shame for that action or not? These were idle and superfluous questions, for the revolver was already lying there before me, and I knew in every fiber of my being that it would happen, for certain, but they excited me, and I raged. I could not die now without having first settled something. In short, the child had saved me, for I put off my pistol shot for the sake of these questions. Meanwhile, the clamor had begun to subside in the captain's room. They had finished their game, were settling down to sleep, and meanwhile were grumbling and languidly winding up their quarrels. At that point, I suddenly fell asleep in my chair at the table, a thing which had never happened to me before. I dropped asleep quite unawares. Dreams, as we all know, are very queer things. Some parts are presented with appalling vividness, with details worked up with the elaborate finish of jewelry, while others one gallops through, as it were, without noticing them at all, as, for instance, through space and time. Dreams seem to be spurred on not by reason but desire, not by the head but by the heart, and yet what complicated tricks my reason has played sometimes in dreams! What utterly incomprehensible things happen to it! My brother died 5 years ago, for instance. I sometimes dream of him. He takes part in my affairs. We are very much interested, and yet all through my dream I quite know and remember that my brother is dead and buried. How is it that I am not surprised that although he is dead, he is here beside me and working with me? Why is it that my reason fully accepts it? But enough. I will begin about my dream. Yes, I dreamt a dream, my dream of the 3rd of November. They tease me now, telling me it was only a dream. But does it matter whether it was a dream or reality, if the dream made known to me the truth? If once one has recognized the truth and seen it, you know that it is the truth, and that there is no other, and there cannot be, whether you are asleep or awake. Let it be a dream. So be it. But that real life of which you make so much, I had meant to extinguish by suicide. And my dream, oh, it revealed to me a different life, renewed, grand, and full of power. Listen. Part 3. I have mentioned that I dropped asleep unawares, and even seemed to be still reflecting upon the same subjects. I suddenly dreamt that I picked up the revolver and aimed it straight at my heart, and not my head, and I had determined beforehand to fire at my head, at my right temple. After aiming at my chest, I waited a second or two, and suddenly my candle, my table, and the wall in front of me began moving and heaving. I made haste to pull the trigger. In dreams, you sometimes fall from a height, or are stabbed or beaten, but you never feel pain unless, perhaps, you really bruise yourself against the bedstead. Then you feel pain, and almost always wake up from it. It was the same in my dream. I did not feel any pain, but it seemed as though with my shot everything within me was shaken, and everything was suddenly dimmed, and it grew horribly black around me. I seemed to be blinded and benumbed, and I was lying on something hard, stretched upon my back. I saw nothing, and could not make the slightest movement. People were walking and shouting around me. The captain bawled, the landlady shrieked, and suddenly another break, and I was being carried in a closed coffin, and I felt how the coffin was shaking, and reflected upon it, and for the first time the idea struck me that I was dead, utterly dead. I knew it, and had no doubt of it. I could neither see nor move, and yet I was feeling and reflecting. But I was soon reconciled to the position, as one usually does in a dream, accepting the facts without disputing them. And now I was buried in the earth. They all went away. I was left alone, utterly alone. I did not move. Whenever before I had imagined being buried, the one sensation I associated with the grave was that of damp and cold. So now I felt that I was very cold, especially the tips of my toes, but I felt nothing else. I lay still. Strange to say, I expected nothing, accepting without dispute that a dead man had nothing to expect. But it was damp. I don't know how long a time passed, whether an hour or several days or many days, but all at once a drop of water fell on my closed left eye, making its way through a coffin lid. It was followed a minute later by a second, and then a minute later by a third, and so on, regularly every minute. There was a sudden glow of profound indignation in my heart, and I suddenly felt in it a pang of physical pain. That's my wound, I thought. That's a bullet. And drop after drop, every minute, kept falling on my closed eyelid. And all at once, not with my voice, but with my whole being, I called upon the power that was responsible for all that was happening to me. Whoever you may be, if you exist, and if anything more rational than what is happening here is possible, suffer it to be here now. But if you are revenging yourself upon me for my senseless suicide by the hideousness and absurdity of this subsequent existence, then let me tell you that no torture could ever equal the contempt which I shall go on dumbly feeling, though my martyrdom may last 1,000,000 years. I made this appeal and held my peace. There was a full minute of unbroken silence, and again another drop fell. But I knew with infinite, unshakable certainty that everything would change immediately. And behold, my grave suddenly was rent asunder. That is, I don't know whether it was opened or dug up, but I was caught up by some dark, unknown being, and we found ourselves in space. I suddenly regained my sight. It was the dead of night, and never, never Had there been such darkness? We were flying through space far away from the earth. I did not question the being who was taking me. I was proud and waited. I assured myself that I was not afraid, and was thrilled with ecstasy at the thought that I was not afraid. I do not know how long we were flying. I cannot imagine. It happened as it always does in dreams, when you skip over space and time and the laws of thought and existence, and only pause upon the points for which the heart yearns. I remember that I suddenly saw in the darkness a star. "Is that serious?" I asked impulsively, though I had not meant to ask any questions. "No, that is the star you saw between the clouds when you were coming home," the being who was carrying me replied. I knew that it had something like a human face. Strange to say, I did not like that being. In fact, I felt an intense aversion for it. I had expected complete non-existence, and that was why I'd put a bullet through my heart. And here I was in the hands of a creature not human, of course, but yet living, existing. And so there is life beyond the grave, I thought, with the strange frivolity one has in dreams. But in its inmost depth, my heart remained unchanged. And if I have got to exist again, I thought, and live once more under the control of some irresistible power, I won't be vanquished and humiliated. "You know that I am afraid of you and despise me for that," I said suddenly to my companion, unable to refrain from the humiliating question, which implied a confession, and feeling my humiliation stab my heart as with a pin. He did not answer my question, but all at once I felt that he was not even despising me, but was laughing at me, and had no compassion for me, and that our journey had an unknown and mysterious object that concerned me only. Fear was growing in my heart. Something was mutely and painfully communicated to me from my silent companion, and permeated my whole being. We were flying through dark, unknown space. I had for some time lost sight of the constellations familiar to my eyes. I knew that there were stars in the heavenly spaces, the light of which took thousands or millions of years to reach the earth. Perhaps we were already flying through those spaces. I expected something with a terrible anguish that tortured my heart, and suddenly I was thrilled by a familiar feeling that stirred me to the depths. I suddenly caught sight of our sun. I knew that it could not be our sun that gave life to our earth, and that we were an infinite distance from our sun. But for some reason, I knew in my whole being that it was a sun exactly like ours, a duplicate of it. A sweet, thrilling feeling resounded with ecstasy in my heart. The kindred power of the same light which had given me light stirred an echo in my heart and awakened it, and I had a sensation of life, the old life of the past, for the first time since I had been in the grave. "But if that is the sun, if that is exactly the same as our sun," I cried, "where is the earth?" And my companion pointed to a star twinkling in the distance with an emerald light. We were flying straight toward it. And are such repetitions possible in the universe? Can that be the law of nature? And if that is an earth there, can it be just the same earth as ours? Just the same? As poor, as unhappy, but precious and beloved forever, arousing in the most ungrateful of her children the same poignant love for her that we feel for our earth? I cried out, shaken by irresistible, ecstatic love for the old familiar earth which I had left. The image of the poor child whom I had repulsed flashed through my mind. "You shall see it all," answered my companion, and there was a note of sorrow in his voice. But we were rapidly approaching the planet. It was growing before my eyes. I could already distinguish the ocean, the outline of Europe, and suddenly a feeling of great and holy jealousy glowed in my heart. How can it be repeated, and what for? I love and can only love the earth which I have left, stained with my blood, when, in my ingratitude, I quenched my life with a bullet in my heart. But I have never ceased to love that earth, and perhaps on the very night I parted from it, I loved it more than ever. Is there suffering upon this new earth? On our earth we can only love with suffering and through suffering. We cannot love otherwise, and we know of no other sort of love. I want suffering in order to love. I long, I thirst, this very instant to kiss with tears the earth that I have left. And I won't accept life on any other. But my companion had already left me. I suddenly, quite without noticing how, found myself on this other earth in the bright light of a sunny day, fair as paradise. I believe I was standing on one of the islands that make up on our globe the Greek archipelago, or on the coast of the mainland facing that archipelago. Oh, everything was exactly as it is with us, only everything seemed to have a festive radiance, the splendor of some great holy triumph attained at last. The caressing sea, green as emerald, splashed softly upon the shore and kissed it with manifest, almost conscious love. The tall, lovely trees stood in all the glory of their blossom, and their innumerable leaves greeted me, I am certain, with their soft, caressing rustle, and seemed to articulate words of love. The grass glowed with bright and fragrant flowers. Birds were flying in flocks in the air, and perched fearlessly on my shoulders and arms, and joyfully struck me with their darling fluttering wings. And at last I saw and knew the people of this happy land. They came to me of themselves, they surrounded me, kissed me, the children of the sun, the children of their sun. Oh, how beautiful they were! Never had I seen on our own earth such beauty in mankind. Only perhaps in our children, in their earlier years, one might find some remote, faint reflection of this beauty. The eyes of these happy people shone with a clear brightness. Their faces were radiant with the light of reason and fullness of a serenity that comes of perfect understanding. But those faces were gay. In their words and voices there was a note of childlike joy. Oh, from the first moment, from the first glance at them, I understood it all. It was the earth untarnished by the fall. On it lived people who had not sinned. They lived just in such a paradise as that in which, according to all the legends of mankind, our first parents lived before they sinned. The only difference was that all this earth was the same paradise. These people, laughing joyfully, thronged around me and caressed me. They took me home with them, and each of them tried to reassure me. Oh, they asked me no questions, but they seemed, I fancied, to know everything without asking, and they wanted to make haste and smooth away the signs of suffering from my face. Section 4. And do you know what? Well, granted that it was only a dream, yet the sensation of the love of those innocent and beautiful people has remained with me forever, and I feel as though their love is still flowing out to me from over there. I have seen them myself, have known them, and been convinced. I loved them. I suffered for them afterwards. Oh, I understood at once, even at the time, that in many things I could not understand them at all. As an up-to-date Russian progressive and contemptible Petersburger, it struck me as inexplicable that, knowing so much, they had, for instance, no science like ours. But I soon realized that their knowledge was gained and fostered by intuitions different from those of us on earth, and that their aspirations, too, were quite different. They desired nothing and were at peace. They did not aspire to knowledge of life as we aspire to understand it, because their lives were full, but their knowledge was higher and deeper than ours. For our science seeks to explain what life is, aspires to understand it, in order to teach others how to live, while they, without science, knew how to live, and that I understood, but I could not understand their knowledge. They showed me their trees, and I could not understand the intense love with which they looked at them. It was as though they were talking with creatures like themselves. And perhaps I shall not be mistaken if I say that they conversed with them. Yes, they had found their language, and I am convinced that the trees understood them. They looked at all nature like that, at the animals who lived in peace with them and did not attack them, but loved them, conquered by their love. They pointed to the stars and told me something about them which I could not understand, but I am convinced that they were somehow in touch with the stars, not only in thought, but by some living channel. Oh, these people did not persist in trying to make me understand them. They loved me without that, but I knew that they would never understand me. And so I hardly spoke to them about our earth. I only kissed in their presence the earth on which they lived, and mutely worshipped them themselves. And they saw that, and let me worship them without being abashed at my adoration, for they themselves loved much. They were not unhappy on my account, when at times I kissed their feet with tears, joyfully conscious of the love with which they would respond to mine. At times I asked myself with wonder how it was that they were able never to offend a creature like me, and never once to arouse a feeling of jealousy or envy in me. Often I wondered how it could be that, boastful and untruthful as I was, I never talked to them of what I knew, of which of course they had no notion, that I was never tempted to do so by a desire to astonish or even to benefit them. They were as gay and sportive as children. They wandered about their lovely woods and copses, they sang their lovely songs. Their fare was light, the fruits of their trees, the honey from their woods, and the milk of the animals who loved them. The work they did for food and raiment was brief and not laborious. They loved and begot children, but I never noticed in them the impulse of that cruel sensuality which overcomes almost every man on this earth, all and each, and is the source of almost every sin of mankind on earth. They rejoiced at the arrival of children as new beings to share their happiness. There was no quarreling, no jealousy among them, and they did not even know what the words meant. Their children were the children of all, for they all made up one family. There was scarcely any illness among them, though there was death. But their old people died peacefully, as though falling asleep, giving blessings and smile to those who surrounded them to take their last farewell, with bright and loving smiles. I never saw grief or tears on those occasions, but only love, which reached the point of ecstasy, but a calm ecstasy made perfect and contemplative. One might think that they were still in contact with the departed after death, and that their earthly union was not cut short by death. They scarcely understood me when I questioned them about immortality, but evidently they were so convinced of it without reasoning that it was not for them a question at all. They had no temples, but they had a real living and uninterrupted sense of oneness with the whole of the universe. They had no creed, but they had a certain knowledge that when their earthly joy had reached the limits of earthly nature, then there would come for them, for the living and for the dead, a still greater fullness of contact with the whole of the universe. They looked forward to that moment with joy, but without haste, not pining for it, but seeming to have a foretaste of it in their hearts, of which they talked to one another. In the evening, before going to sleep, they liked singing in musical and harmonious chorus. In these songs they expressed all the sensation that the parting day had given them, sang its glories, and took leave of it. They sang the praises of nature, of the sea, of the woods. They liked making songs about one another, and praised each other like children. They were the simplest songs, but they sprang from their hearts and went to one's heart. And not only in their songs, but in all their lives, they seemed to do nothing but admire one another. It was like being in love with each other, but an all-embracing, universal feeling. Some of their songs, solemn and rapturous, I scarcely understood at all. Though I understood the words, I could never fathom their full significance. It remained, as it were, beyond the grasp of my mind, yet my heart unconsciously absorbed it more and more. I often told them that I had had a presentiment of it long before, that this joy and glory had come to me on our earth in the form of a yearning melancholy that at times approached insufferable sorrow, that I had had a foreknowledge of them all, and of their glory in the dreams of my heart and visions of my mind, that often on our earth I could not look at the setting sun without tears, that in my hatred for the men of our earth there was always a yearning anguish. Why could I not hate them without loving them? Why could I not help forgiving them? And in my love for them there was a yearning grief. Why could I not love them without hating them? They listened to me, and I saw they could not conceive what I was saying, but I did not regret that I had spoken to them of it. I knew that they understood the intensity of my yearning anguish over those whom I had left. But when they looked at me with their sweet eyes full of love, when I felt that in their presence my heart too became as innocent and just as theirs, the feeling of the fullness of life took my breath away, and I worshipped them in silence. Oh, everyone laughs in my face now, and assures me that one cannot dream of such details as I am telling now, that I only dreamed or felt one sensation that arose in my heart in delirium, and made up the details myself when I woke up. And when I told them that perhaps it really was so, my God, how they shouted with laughter in my face, and what mirth I caused! Oh yes, of course I was overcome by the mere sensation of my dream, and that was all that was preserved in my cruelly wounded heart. But the actual forms and images of my dream, that is, the very ones I really saw at the very time of my dream, were filled with such harmony, were so lovely and enchanting, and were so actual, that on awakening I was, of course, incapable of clothing them in our poor language, so that they were bound to become blurred in my mind. And so, perhaps, I really was forced afterward to make up the details, and so, of course, to distort them in my passionate desire to convey some at least of them as quickly as I could. But on the other hand, how can I help believing that it was all true? It was perhaps 1,000 times brighter, happier, and more joyful than I describe it. Granted that I dreamed it, yet it must have been real. You know, I will tell you a secret. Perhaps it was not a dream at all. For then something happened so awful, something so horribly true, that it could not have been imagined in a dream. My heart may have originated the dream, but would my heart alone have been capable of originating the awful event which happened to me afterward? How could I alone have invented it or imagined it in my dream? Could my petty heart and my fickle, trivial mind have risen to such a revelation of truth? Oh, judge for yourselves. Hitherto I have concealed it, but now I will tell the truth. The fact is that I corrupted them all. Section 5. Yes, yes, it ended in my corrupting them all. How could it come to pass? I do not know, but I remember it clearly. The dream embraced thousands of years and left in me only a sense of the whole. I only know that I was the cause of their sin and downfall. Like a vile trichina, like a germ of the plague infecting whole kingdoms, so I contaminated all this earth, so happy and sinless before my coming. They learnt to lie, grow fond of lying, and discovered the charm of falsehood. Oh, at first perhaps it began innocently, with a jest, coquetry, with amorous play, perhaps indeed with a germ, but that germ of falsity made its way into their hearts and pleased them. Then sensuality was soon begotten. Sensuality begot jealousy, jealousy, cruelty. Oh, I don't know, I don't remember, but soon, very soon, the first blood was shed. They marveled and were horrified and began to be split up and divided. They formed into unions, but it was against one another. Reproaches, upbraidings followed. They came to know shame, and shame brought them to virtue. The conception of honor sprang up, and every union began waving its flags. They began torturing animals, and the animals withdrew from them into the forests and became hostile to them. They began to struggle for separation, for isolation, for individuality, for mine and thine. They began to talk in different languages. They became acquainted with sorrow and loved sorrow. They thirsted for suffering and said that truth could only be attained through suffering. Then science appeared. As they became wicked, they began talking of brotherhood and humanitarianism and understood those ideas. As they became criminal, they invented justice and drew up whole legal codes in order to observe it, and to ensure their being kept, set up a guillotine. They hardly remembered what they had lost, in fact refused to believe that they had ever been happy and innocent. They even laughed at the possibility of this happiness in the past, and called it a dream. They could not even imagine it in definite form and shape, but strange and wonderful to relate, though they lost all faith in their past happiness and called it a legend. They so longed to be happy and innocent once more that they succumbed to this desire like children, made an idol of it, set up temples and worshipped their own idea, their own desire, though at the same time they fully believed that it was unattainable and could not be realized. Yet they bowed down to it and adored it with tears. Nevertheless, if it could have happened, they had returned to the innocent and happy condition which they had lost, and if someone had shown it to them again and had asked them whether they wanted to go back to it, they would certainly have refused. They answered me, "We may be deceitful, wicked, and unjust. We know it and weep over it. We grieve over it. We torment and punish ourselves more perhaps than that merciful judge who will judge us and whose name we know not. But we have science, and by means of it we shall find the truth, and we shall arrive at it consciously. Knowledge is higher than feeling. The consciousness of life is higher than life. Science will give us wisdom. Wisdom will reveal the laws, and the knowledge of the laws of happiness is higher than happiness." That is what they said. And after saying such things, everyone began to love himself better than anyone else, and indeed they could not do otherwise. All became so jealous of the rights of their own personality that they did their very utmost to curtail and destroy them in others, and made that the chief thing in their lives. Slavery followed, even voluntary slavery. The weak eagerly submitted to the strong, on condition that the latter aided them to subdue the still weaker. Then there were saints. who came to these people weeping and talked to them of their pride, of their loss of harmony, and due proportion of their loss of shame. They were laughed at or pelted with stones. Holy blood was shed on the threshold of the temples. Then there arose men who began to think how to bring all the people together again, so that everybody, while still loving himself best of all, might not interfere with others, and all might live together in something like a harmonious society. Regular wars sprang up over this idea. All the combatants at the same time firmly believed that science, wisdom, and the instinct of self-preservation would force men at last to unite into a harmonious and rational society. And so, meanwhile, to hasten matters, the wise endeavored to exterminate as rapidly as possible all who were not wise, and did not understand their idea that the latter might not hinder its triumph. But the instinct of self-preservation grew rapidly weaker. There arose men, haughty and sensual, who demanded all or nothing. In order to obtain everything, they resorted to crime, and if they did not succeed, to suicide. There arose religions with a cult of non-existence and self-destruction for the sake of the everlasting peace of annihilation. At last these people grew weary of their meaningless toil, and signs of suffering came into their faces, and then they proclaimed that suffering was beauty, for in suffering alone was their meaning. They glorified suffering in their songs. I moved about among them, wringing my hands and weeping over them, but I loved them perhaps more than in the old days when there was no suffering in their faces and when they were innocent and so lovely. I loved the earth they had polluted even more than when it had been a paradise, if only because sorrow had come to it. Alas, I always loved sorrow and tribulation, but only for myself. But I wept over them, pitying them. I stretched out my hands to them in despair, blaming, cursing, and despising myself. I told them that all this was my doing, mine alone, that it was I had brought them to corruption, contamination, and falsity. I besought them to crucify me. I taught them how to make a cross. I could not go myself. I had not the strength, but I wanted to suffer at their hands. I yearned for suffering. I longed that my blood should be drained to the last drop in these agonies. But they only laughed at me, and began at last to look upon me as crazy. They justified me. They declared that they had only got what they wanted themselves, and that all that now was could not have been otherwise. At last they declared to me that I was becoming dangerous, and that they should lock me up in a madhouse if I could not hold my tongue. Then such grief took possession of my soul that my heart was wrung, and I felt as though I were dying. And then I awoke. It was morning. That is, it was not yet daylight, but about 6 o'clock. I woke up in the same armchair. My candle had burnt out. Everyone was asleep in the captain's room, and there was a stillness all round, rare in our flat. First of all, I leapt up in great amazement. Nothing like this had ever happened to me before, not even the most vivid, trivial detail. I had never, for instance, fallen asleep like this in my armchair. While I was standing and coming to myself, I suddenly caught sight of my revolver lying loaded and ready, but instantly I thrust it away. Oh, now, life, life! I lifted up my hands and called upon eternal truth, not with words, but with tears. Ecstasy, immeasurable ecstasy, flooded my soul. Yes, life and spreading the good tidings. Oh, I look at that moment resolved to spread the good tidings, and resolved it, of course, for my whole life. I go to spread the tidings. I want to spread the tidings. Of what? Of the truth, for I have seen it. I have seen it with my own eyes. I have seen it in all its glory. And since then I have been preaching. Moreover, I love all those who laugh at me more than any of the rest. Why that is so I do not know and cannot explain, but so be it. I am told that I am vague and confused, that if I am vague and confused now, what shall I be later on? It is true indeed. I am vague and confused, and perhaps as time goes on I shall be more so. And of course I shall make many blunders before I find out how to preach, that is, find out what words to say and what things to do, for it is a very difficult task. I see all that as clear as daylight. But listen, who does not make mistakes? And yet, all are making for the same goal, all are striving in the same direction anyway, from the sage to the lowest robber, only by different roads. It is an old truth, but this is what is new. I cannot go far wrong, for I have seen the truth. I have seen and I know that people can be beautiful and happy without losing the power of living on earth. I will not and cannot believe that evil is the normal condition of mankind, and it is just this faith of mine that they laugh at. But how can I help believing it? I have seen the truth. It is not as though I had invented it with my mind. I have seen it, and the living image of it has filled my soul forever. I have seen it in such full perfection that I cannot believe that it is impossible for people to have it. And so, how can I go wrong? I shall make some slips, no doubt, and shall perhaps talk in second-hand language, but not for long. The living image of what I saw will always be with me, and will always correct and guide me. Oh, I am full of courage and freshness, and I will go on and on if it were for 1,000 years. Do you know, at first I meant to conceal the fact that I corrupted them. But that was a mistake. That was my first mistake. But truth whispered to me that I was lying, and preserved me and corrected me. But how establish paradise? I don't know, because I do not know how to put it into words. After my dream I lost command of words. All the chief words, anyway, the most necessary ones. But never mind, I shall go and I shall keep talking. I won't leave off, for anyway I have seen it with my own eyes, though I cannot describe what I saw. But the scoffers do not understand that. It was a dream, they say, delirium, hallucination. Oh, as though that meant so much, and they are so proud. A dream! What is a dream? And is not our life a dream? I will say more. Suppose that this paradise will never come to pass. That I understand. Yet I shall go on preaching it, and yet how simple it is. In one day, in 1 hour, everything could be arranged at once. The chief thing is to love others like yourself. That's the great thing, and that's everything. Nothing else is wanted. You'll find out at once how to arrange it, and yet it's an old truth which has been told and retold 1,000,000,000 times, but it has not formed part of our lives. The consciousness of life is higher than life. The knowledge of the laws of happiness is higher than happiness. That is what one must contend against. And I shall. If only everyone wants it, it can all be arranged at once. And I tracked out that little girl, and I shall go on and on. End of The Dream of a Ridiculous Man by Fyodor Dostoyevsky.
The Dream by Edna St. Vincent Millay, read for Dreams Collection 1, Stories and Poems by Sarah Brown. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dream by Edna St. Vincent Millay. Love, if I weep, it will not matter, and if you laugh, I shall not care. Foolish am I to think about it, but it is good to feel you there. Love, in my sleep I dreamed of waking. White and awful the moonlight reached. Over the floor and somewhere, there was a shutter loose. It screeched. Swung in the wind and no wind blowing, I was afraid and turned to you. Put out my hand to you for comfort, and you were gone, cold, cold as dew. Under my hand the moonlight lay. Love, if you laugh, I shall not care. But if I weep, it will not matter. Ah, it is good to feel you there. End of the Dream by Edna St. Vincent Millay.
A Curious Dream, written about 1870, containing a moral, by Mark Twain, recorded by William Jones in Bonita Springs, Florida. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Curious Dream. Night before last, I had a singular dream. I seemed to be sitting on a doorstep, in no particular city perhaps, ruminating, and the time of night appeared to be about 12 or 1 o'clock. The weather was balmy and delicious. There was no human sound in the air, not even a footstep. There was no sound of any kind to emphasize the dead stillness, except the occasional hollow barking of a dog in the distance, and the fainter answer of a further dog. Presently, up the street I heard a bony clack-clacking, and guessed it was the castanets of a serenading party. In a minute more, a tall skeleton, hooded and half-clad in a tattered and mouldy shroud, whose shreds were flapping about the ribby lattice-work of its person, swung by me with a stately stride and disappeared in the gray gloom of the starlight. It had a broken and worm-eaten coffin on its shoulder, and a bundle of something in its hand. I knew what the clack-clacking was then. It was this party's joints working together, and his elbows knocking against his sides as they walked. I may say I was surprised. Before I could collect my thoughts and enter upon any speculations as to what this apparition might portend, I heard another one coming, for I recognized his click-clack. He had 2/3 of a coffin on his shoulder, and some foot and headboards under his arm. I mightily wanted to peer under his hood and speak to him, but when he turned and smiled upon me, with his cavernous sockets and his projecting grin as he went by, I thought I would not detain him. He was hardly gone when I heard the clacking again, and another one issued from the shadowy half-light. This one was bending under a heavy gravestone and dragging a shabby coffin after him by a string. When he got to me, he gave me a steady look for a moment or two, then rounded to and backed up to me, saying, "Ease this down for a fellow, will you?" I eased the gravestone down till it rested on the ground, and in doing so noticed that it bore the name of John Baxter Copmanhurst, with May 1839 as the date of his death. Deceased sat wearily down by me and wiped his os frontis with his major maxillary, chiefly from former habit, I judged, for I could not see that he brought away any perspiration. "It's too bad, said he, drawing the remnant of the shroud about him and leaning his jaw pensively on his hand. Then he put his left foot up on his knee and fell to scratching his ankle bone absently with a rusty nail which he got out of his coffin. "What is too bad, friend?" "Oh, everything, everything. I almost wish I never had died." "You surprise me. Why do you say this? Has anything gone wrong? What is the matter?" "Matter? Look at this shroud rags. Look at this gravestone all battered up. Look at that disgraceful old coffin. All a man's property going to ruin and destruction before his eyes. And ask him if anything is wrong? Fire and brimstone. Calm yourself, I said. It is too bad. It is certainly too bad, but then I had not supposed that you would much mind such matters, situated as you are. Well, my dear sir, I do mind them. My pride is hurt, my comfort is impaired, destroyed, I might say. I will state my case. I will put it to you in such a way you can comprehend it, if you will let me, said the poor skeleton, tilting the hood of his shroud back as if he were clearing for action, and thus unconsciously giving himself a jaunty and festive air, very much at variance with the grave character of his position in life, so to speak, and in prominent contrast with his distressful mood. Proceed, said I. I reside in the shameful old graveyard, a block or two above you here, in this street. There, now, I just expected that cartilage would let go. Third rib from the bottom, friend. Hitch the end of it to my spine with a string, if you have got such a thing about you, though a bit of silver wire is a deal pleasanter and more durable and becoming if one keeps it polished. To think of shredding out and going to pieces in this way, just on account of the indifference and neglect of one's posterity. And the poor ghost grated his teeth in a way that gave me a wrench and a shiver, for the effect is mightily increased by the absence of muffling flesh and cuticle. I reside in that old graveyard and have for these 30 years, and I tell you things are changed since I first laid this old tired frame there, and turned over and stretched out for a long sleep, with a delicious sense upon me of being done with bother and grief and anxiety and doubt and fear forever and ever, and listening with comfortable and increasing satisfaction to the sexton's work, from the startling clatter of his first spadeful on my coffin till it dulled away to the faint patting that shaped the roof of my new home. Delicious! My! I wish you could try it tonight. And out of my reverie, deceased fetched me a rattling slap with a bony head. Yes, sir, 30 years ago I laid me down there, and was happy, for it was out in the country then, out in the breezy, flowery, grand old woods, and the lazy winds gossiped with the leaves, and the squirrels capered over us and around us, and the creeping things visited us, and the birds filled the tranquil solitude with music. Ah, it was worth 10 years of a man's life to be dead then. Everything was pleasant. I was in a good neighborhood, for all the dead people that lived near me belonged to the best families in the city. Our posterity appeared to think the world of us. They kept our graves in the very best condition. The fences were always in faultless repair. Headboards were kept painted or whitewashed, and were replaced with new ones as soon as they began to look rusty or decayed. Monuments were kept upright, railings intact and bright, the rose bushes and shrubbery trimmed, trained, and free from blemish, the walks clean and smooth and gravelled. But that day has gone by. Our descendants have forgotten us. My grandson lives in a stately house built with money made by these old hands of mine, and I sleep in a neglected grave with invading vermin that gnaw my shroud to build them nests withal. I and friends that lie with me founded and secured the prosperity of this fine city, and the stately bantling of our loves leaves us to rot in a dilapidated cemetery, for neighbors curse and strangers scoff at. See the difference between the old time and this. For instance, our graves are all caved in now. Our headboards have rotted away and tumbled down. Our railings reel this way and that, with one foot in the air after a fashion of unseemly levity. Our monuments lean wearily, and our gravestones bow their heads discouraged. There be no ornaments any more, no roses, nor shrubs, nor gravelled walks, nor anything that is a comfort to the eye, and even the paintless old board fence that did make a show of holding us sacred from companionship with beasts and the defilement of heedless feet, has tottered till it overhangs the street and only advertises the presence of our dismal resting place, and invites yet more derision to it. And now we cannot hide our poverty and tatters in the friendly woods, for the city has stretched its withering arms abroad and taking us in, and all that remains of the cheer of our old home is the cluster of lugubrious forest trees that stand, bored and weary of a city life, with their feet in our coffins, looking into the hazy distance and wishing they were there. I tell you, it's disgraceful. You begin to comprehend? You begin to see how it is? While our descendants are living sumptuously on our money, right around us in the city, we have to fight hard to keep skull and bones together. Bless you, there isn't a grave in our cemetery that doesn't leak, not one. Every time it rains in the night, we have to climb out and roost in the trees, and sometimes we are wakened suddenly by the chilly water trickling down the backs of our necks. Then I tell you, there is a general heaving up of old graves, and kicking over of old monuments, and scampering of old skeletons for the trees. Bless me, if you had gone along there some such nights after 12, you might have seen as many as 15 of us roosting on one limb, with our joints rattling drearily and the wind wheezing through our ribs. Many a time we have perched there for 3 or 4 dreary hours, then come down, stiff and chilled through and drowsy, and borrowed each other's skulls to bail out our graves with. If you will glance up in my mouth, now as I tilt my head back, you can see my headpiece is half full of old dry sediment. How top-heavy and stupid it makes me sometimes. Yes, sir, many a time if you had happened to come along just before the dawn, you'd have caught us bailing out the graves and hanging our shrouds on the fence to dry. Why, I had an elegant shroud stolen from there one morning. Think a party by the name of Smith took it, that resides in a plebeian graveyard over yonder. I think so because the first time I ever saw him, he hadn't anything on but a check shirt. And the last time I saw him, which was at a social gathering in the new cemetery, he was the best dressed corpse in the company. And it is a significant fact that he left when he saw me. And presently an old woman from here missed her coffin. She generally took it with her when she went anywhere because she was liable to take cold and bring on the spasmodic rheumatism that originally killed her if she exposed herself to the night air much. She was named Hotchkiss, Anna Matilda Hotchkiss. You might know her. She has 2 upper front teeth, is tall, but a good deal inclined to stoop, one rib on the left side gone, has one shred of rusty hair hanging from the left side of her head, and one little tuft just above and a little forward of her right ear, has her underjaw wired on one side where it had worked loose, small bone of left forearm gone, lost in a fight, has a kind of swagger in her gait and a gallus way of going with her arms akimbo and her nostrils in the air, has been pretty free and easy, and is all damaged and battered up till it looks like a queensware crate in ruins. Maybe you've met her? God forbid! I involuntarily ejaculated, for somehow I was not looking for that form of question, and it caught me a little off my guard. But I hastened to make amends for my rudeness and say, I simply meant I had not had the honor, for I would not deliberately speak discourteously of a friend of yours. You were saying that you were robbed, and it was a shame too, but it appears by what is left of the shroud you have on that it was a costly one in its day. How did... A most ghastly expression began to develop among the decayed features and shriveled integuments of my guest's face, and I was beginning to grow uneasy and distressed, when he told me he was only working up a deep, sly smile with a wink in it, to suggest about the time he acquired his present garment, a ghost in a neighboring cemetery missed one. Well, this reassured me, but I begged him to confine himself to speech thenceforth, because his facial expression was uncertain, even with the most elaborate care. It was liable to misfire. Smiling should especially be avoided. What he might honestly consider a shining success was likely to strike me in a very different light. I said I'd like to see a skeleton cheerful, even decorously playful, but I did not think smiling was a skeleton's best hold. Yes, friend, said the poor skeleton, the facts are just as I have given them to you. 2 of these old graveyards, the one that I resided in, and one further along, have been deliberately neglected by our descendants of today until there is no occupying them any longer. Aside from the osteological discomfort of it, and that is no light matter in this rainy weather, the present state of things is ruinous to property. We have got to move, or be content to see our effects wasted away and utterly destroyed. Now you will hardly believe it, but it is true, nevertheless, that there isn't a single coffin in good repair among all my acquaintances. Now that is an absolute fact. I do not refer to low people who come in a pine box mounted on an express wagon, but I am talking about your high-toned, silver-mounted burial case, your monumental sort that travel under black plumes at the head of a procession and have choice of cemetery lots. I mean folks like the Jarvises and the Bledsoes and Burlings and such. They are all about ruined. The most substantial people in our set they were, and now look at them, utterly used up and poverty-stricken. One of the Bledsoes actually traded his monument to a late barkeeper for some fresh shavings to put under his head. I tell you it speaks volumes, for there is nothing a corpse takes so much pride in as his monument. He loves to read the inscription. He comes after a while to believe what it says of himself, and then you may see him sitting on the fence night after night enjoying it. Epitaphs are cheap, and they do a poor chap a world of good after he is dead, especially if he had hard luck while he was alive. I wish they were used more. Now, I don't complain, but confidentially I do think it was a little shabby in my descendants to give me nothing but this old slab of a gravestone, and all the more that there isn't a compliment on it. It used to have "Gone to his just reward" on it, and I was proud when I first saw it, but by and by I noticed that whenever an old friend of mine came along, he would hook his chin over the railing and pull a long face, and read along down till he came to that, and then he would chuckle to himself and walk off, looking satisfied and comfortable. So I scratched it off to get rid of those fools. But a dead man always takes a great deal of pride in his monument. Yonder goes 6 of the Jarvises now, with a family monument along, and Smithers and some hired spectres went by with his a while ago. Hello, Higgins! Goodbye, old friend. That's Meredith Higgins, died in 44. Belongs to our set in a cemetery. Fine old family. Great-grandmother was an Injun. I am on the most familiar terms with him. He didn't hear me was the reason he didn't answer me. And I am sorry, too, because I would have liked to introduce you. You would admire him. He is the most disjointed, swayed-back, and generally distorted old skeleton you ever saw. He is full of fun. When he laughs, it sounds like rasping two stones together, and he always starts it off with a cheery screech, like raking a nail across a window pane. Hey, Jones! That is old Columbus Jones. Shroud cost $400. Entire trousseau, including monument, $2,700. This is in the spring of 26. It was enormous style for those days. Dead people came all the way from the Alleghenies to see his things. The party that occupied the grave next to mine remembers it well. Now, do you see that individual going along with a piece of headboard under his arm, one leg bone below his knee gone, and not a thing in the world on? That is Barstow Dalhousie, and next to Columbus Jones, he was the most sumptuously outfitted person that ever entered our cemetery. We are all leaving. We cannot tolerate the treatment we are receiving at the hands of our descendants. They open new cemeteries, but they leave us to our ignominy. They mend the streets, but they never mend anything that is about us or belongs to us. Look at that coffin of mine. Yet I tell you, in its day, it was a piece of furniture that would have attracted attention in any drawing room in the city. You may have it if you want it. I can't afford to repair it. Put a new bottom in her, and part of a new top, and a bit of fresh lining along the left side, and you'll find her is about as comfortable as any receptacle of her species you ever tried. No, thanks. No, don't mention it. You have been civil to me, and I would give you all the property I have got before I would seem ungrateful. Now, this winding sheet is a kind of sweet thing in its way. Would you like to? No? Well, just as you say, but I wish to be fair and liberal. There's nothing mean about me. Goodbye, friend. I must be going. I may have a good way to go tonight. Don't know. I only know one thing for certain, and that is that I am on the immigrant trail now, and I'll never sleep in that crazy old cemetery again. I will travel till I find respectable quarters, if I have to hoof it to New Jersey. All the boys are going. It was decided in public conclave last night to emigrate, and by the time the sun rises there won't be a bone left in our old habitations. Such cemeteries may suit my surviving friends, but they do not suit the remains that have the honor to make these remarks. My opinion is the general opinion. If you doubt it, go and see how the departing ghosts upset things before they started. They were almost riotous in their demonstrations of distaste. Hello, here are some of the Bledsoes, and if you will give me a lift with this tombstone, I guess I will join company and jog along with them. Mighty respectable old family, the Bledsoes. They used to always come out in 6-horse hearses and all that sort of thing 50 years ago when I walked these streets in daylight. Goodbye, friend. And with his gravestone on his shoulder, he joined the grisly procession, dragging his damaged coffin after him, for notwithstanding he pressed it upon me so earnestly, I utterly refused his hospitality. I suppose that for as much as 2 hours these sad outcasts went clacking by, laden with their dismal effects, and all that time I sat pitying them. One or two of the youngest and least dilapidated among them inquired about midnight trains on the railways, but the rest seemed unacquainted with that mode of travel, and merely asked about common public roads to various towns and cities, some of which are not on the map now, and vanished from it and from the earth as much as 30 years ago, and some few of them never had existed anywhere but on maps, and private ones, in the real estate agencies at that. And they asked me about the condition of the cemeteries in these towns and cities, and about the reputation the citizens bore as to reverence for the dead. This whole matter interested me deeply, and likewise compelled my sympathy for these homeless ones. And it all seeming real, and I not knowing it was a dream, I mentioned to one shrouded wanderer an idea that had entered my head, to publish an account of this curious and very sorrowful exodus, and said also that I might not describe it truthfully and just as it occurred, without seeming to trifle with a grave subject, and exhibit an irreverence for the dead that would shock and distress their surviving friends. But this bland and stately remnant of a former citizen leaned him far over my gate, and whispered in my ear, and said, "Do not let that disturb you. The community that can stand such graveyards as those we are immigrating from can stand anything a body can say about the neglected and forsaken dead that lie in them." At that very moment a cock crowed, and the weird procession vanished, and left not a shred or a bone behind. I awoke, and found myself lying with my head out of the bed and sagging downward considerably. A position favorable to dreaming dreams with morals in them, maybe, but not poetry. Note: the reader is assured that if the cemeteries in his town are kept in good order, this dream is not leveled at his town at all, but is leveled particularly and venomously at the next town. End of A Curious Dream by Mark Twain.
Kubla Khan by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Recorded for Dreams Collection No. 1, Stories and Poems by Algy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Kubla Khan, or A Vision in a Dream. A Fragment by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers, were girdled round. And here were gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree, and here were forests, ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. But oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedarn cover! A savage place! As holy and enchanted as ere beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. And from this chasm, with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift half-intermitted burst huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail, or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail. Amid these dancing rocks at once and ever it flung up momently the sacred river. 5 miles meandering with a mazy motion through wood and dale the sacred river ran, then reached the caverns measureless to man, and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. And mid this tumult Kubla heard from far ancestral voices prophesying war. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain and the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid,
and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such a deep delight 'twould win me, that with music loud and long I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, Beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair! Weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honey dew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise. End of Kubla Khan, by Samuel Taylor Coleridge.
The Christmas Dream of Little Charles, by Justice Starr Redfield. Recorded for Dreams Collection 1, Stories and Poems, by Mokka. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Christmas Dream of Little Charles, Justice Starr Redfield. One Christmas Eve, little Charles Estabrook hung his stocking carefully by the chimney corner, and, after saying his prayers, got into bed and soon fell asleep. Charles was a good little boy. He was fond of horses, and took pleasure in feeding them and attending to their wants. On the day previous, a traveller came along. His horse was thirsty, so little Charles got a pail, filled it with water, and gave the horse to drink, for which the traveller rewarded him by giving him a shilling. But, although so fond of horses, little Charles was not unmindful to the claims of his sister Lizzie, as she was familiarly called, and, in pleasant weather, would go out to walk with her. In the engraving opposite, they are on their way to school together, and have stopped that he may tie her shoe, which has become unfastened. Charles dreamed that he was in bed, peeping at his stocking over the bedclothes, when he saw a very pleasant-looking old gentleman come down the chimney, on a nice little pony, precisely like the one named Lightfoot that his Uncle Ben had promised to give him. It was funny indeed to see the pony slide down feet foremost, and Charles could not help laughing. But he laughed still louder when he examined old Nicholas the rider. His hair was made of crackers, and as he came nearer and nearer to the lamp that stood on the hearth, pop went one of the crackers, then another, and then another. But St. Nicholas was not a bit frightened. He only rubbed his ears with his coat sleeve, patted the pony to keep him quiet, and laughed till he showed the concave of his great mouth, full of sugar plums. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf. Charlie laughed when he saw him, in spite of himself, while a wink of his eye, a twist of his head, soon gave him to know he had nothing to dread. Charles was excessively delighted, and shouted so loud that his mother thought he had a nightmare. He watched the old gentleman closely, and then looked at his stocking. It hung very conveniently. "He can't put the pony in it," said he to himself. "That's a pity." The old gentleman's pockets stood out prodigiously, and he panted and puffed as if he had been cudgelling an alligator. "Well," said he, wiping the perspiration off his face, although it was the 25th of December, "if this is not hard work, 85 youngsters have I called on the last hour. Hark, St. Michael's sounds loud down the chimney. 1, 2. I shall have a tough job from 2 o'clock till daylight, popping down the chimneys from the battery to the high bridge. I wonder what this chap will like for a Christmas present," continued he, eyeing the stocking, and then putting his arms akimbo, he began to consider. Charles' heart beat. "Good Mr. Nicholas," said he to himself, "if you could only give me that pony." But he kept quite still, for he saw the old man put his hands into his tremendous pockets. Let me see," said old Nicholas. "Here's a jackknife that I was to have given Tommy Battle, if he had not quarrelled with his sisters. Open sesame!" The stocking opened, and in went the jackknife. It was the very thing that Charles wanted. One after another, the old gentleman pulled out tops, twine, marbles, dissected maps, picture books, sugar plums, besides divers other notions, all the while talking to himself. "This drum," said he, "is for Tom Barnwell, a clever little fellow who never tells lies. This pretty little fishhook sent the line Master Trout must have, for his patient care of his father when he was sick. This mask is for Horace Allan. He must not use it to frighten little children, or I shall remember it when Christmas comes again. Let me see. I will give this globe to Joseph Dudley, who is a studious boy, and he will make a good use of it. This pretty annual was for William Wiley, but the lad kicked his brother and called him a bad name, so I will lay it by for George Wilde. Charles thought he could stay forever to see the old gentleman take out his knick-knacks and tell who they were for, but he began to be a little frightened for his own stocking when he recollected that he had been remiss in his Latin the last quarter. "I hope the old gentleman does not understand the classics," said Charlie to himself, but he stopped short, for his queer visitor held up the stocking, saying, "I think this laird loves gunpowder by the smell of his stocking." He then took hold of his hair, and pulling out crackers by the dozen from his head, tied them into neat parcels, and threw them into the stocking. As fast as he pulled them off, new crackers appeared and hung down over his ears and forehead. "This accounts for the noise we hear on Christmas," said Charles. "I never knew who made all the crackers," and he had to hold his sides for laughing, the old man looked so droll. When the old gentleman stooped over the light to put a new supply in the stocking, an unusual number exploded, and the little pony, giving a start up the chimney, disappeared. Charles awoke. It was just daylight. He sprang out of bed, roused all the family with his "Merry Christmas!" ran to the stable, and what should he see but Uncle Ben's little pony, with a halter on his neck, on which was tied a piece of paper written, "A Merry Christmas with the Pony Lightfoot for my nephew Charles." End of The Christmas Dream of Little Charles by Justice Star Redfield.
The Nightmare by William Danby. Read for Dreams Collection 1, Stories and Poems by Colleen McMahon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Nightmare by William Danby. I come in gleams from the land of dreams, wrapped round in the midnight's pall. You may hear my moan in the night wind's groan, when the tapestry flaps on the wall. I come from my rest in the death owl's nest, where she screams in fear and pain, and my wings gleam bright in the wild moonlight as it whirls round the madman's brain, and down sweeps my car like a falling star, while the winds have hushed their breath, when you feel in the air from the cold sepulchre the faint damp smell of death. My vigil I keep by the murderer's sleep, when dreams round his senses spin, and I ride on his breast and trouble his rest in the shape of his deadliest sin. And hollow and low is his moan of woe in the depth of his strangling pain, and his cold black eye rolls in agony and faintly rattles his chain. The sweat drops fall on the dark prison wall. He wakes with a deep-drawn sigh. He hears my tread as I pass from his bed, and he calls on the saints on high. I fly to the bed where the weary head of the poet its rest must seek, and with false dreams of fame I kindle the flame of joy on his pallid cheek. No thought does he take of the world awake and its cold and heartless pleasure. The holy fire of his own loved lyre is his best and dearest treasure. But neglect's foul sting that cheek shall bring to a darker and deadlier hue. The last dear token his lyre is broken, and his heart is broken too. When the maiden asleep for her lover may weep afar on the boundless sea, and she dreams he is pressed to her welcome breast, returned from his dangers free, I come in the form of a wave of the storm and sweep him away from her heart. And then in a dream she starts with a scream to think that in death they part. And still in the light of her dream-bound sight, the images whirl and dance, till my swift elision dispels the vision, and she wakes as from a trance. With dreams I affright the startled sight of the miser withered and old, and he strives to arise with horrible cries as he thinks of his stolen gold. But faint is each limb, and ghastly and grim gurgles his stifled gasp, and his sinews I strain on his bed of pain, till he faints in my elvish grasp. An awful one with a hand of bone seems to beckon him off to the tomb, and I laugh as I whirl through the night's black furl and the film of the shadowy gloom. When the sweet babe lies with its half-closed eyes as blue as the sky of even, and you know the while by its innocent smile that its dreams are of joy in heaven, I steal to the bed where that gentle head in meek composure lies, and with phantoms of fright I break the light of its visions of paradise. Oh, the horror and fear of that night so drear is long ere it pass away, and the fearful glare of my fiendish stare is remembered for many a day. When the clouds first born of the breezy morn in the eastern chambers roam, I glide away in the twilight gray to rest in my shadowy home, and darkness and sleep to their kingdom sweep, and dreams rustle by like a storm. But where I dwell no man can tell who hath seen my hideous form, whether it be in the caves of the sea where the rolling breakers go, or the crystal sphere of the upper air, or the depths of hell below. End of The Nightmare by William Danby.
Dreamworld by R.A. Lafcadio. Recorded for Dreams Collection 1, Stories and Poems by mokka. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dreamworld, R.A. Lafcadio. It was the awfulest dream in the world, no doubt about it. In fact, it seemed to be the only dream there was. He was a morning type, so it was unusual that he should feel depressed in the morning. He tried to account for it, and could not. He was a healthy man, so he ate a healthy breakfast. He was not too depressed for that, and he listened unconsciously to the dark girl with a musical voice. Often she ate kales in the morning with her girl friend. Grape juice, pineapple juice, orange juice, apple juice. Why did people look at him suspiciously just because he took 4 or 5 sorts of juice for breakfast? Agnes, it was ghastly. I was built like a sack full of skunk cabbage, I swear. And I was a green-brown colour and had hair like a latrine mop. Agnes, I was sick with misery. It just isn't possible for anybody to feel so low. I can't shake it at all. And the whole world was like the underside of a log. It wasn't that, though. It wasn't just one bunch of things. It was everything. It was a world of things just weren't worth living. I can't come out of it. Teresa, it was only a dream. Sausage, only 4 little links for an order. Do people think he was a glutton because he had 4 orders of sausage? It didn't seem like very much. My mother was a monster. She was a wart-hoggish animal, and yet she was still recognisable. How could my mother look like a warthog and still look like my mother? Mama's pretty. Teresa, it was only a dream. Forget it. The stares a man must suffer just to get a dozen pancakes on his plate. What was the matter with people who called 4 pancakes a tall stack? And what was odd about ordering a quarter of a pound of butter? It was better than having 20 of those little pats, each on its coaster. Agnes, we all of us had eyes that backed out, and we stank, we were bloated, and all the time it rained a dirty green rain that smelled like a 4-letter word. Good grief, girl, we had hair all over us where we were in warts, and we talked like cracked crows. We had crawlers. I itched just from thinking about it, and the dirty parts of the dream I won't even tell you. I've never felt so blue in my life. I just don't know how I'll make the day through. Teresa, doll, how could a dream upset you so much? There isn't a thing wrong with ordering 3 eggs sunny side up, and 3 over easy, and 3 poached ever so soft, and 6 of them scrambled. What law says a man should have all of his eggs fixed alike? Nor is there anything wrong with ordering 5 cups of coffee. That way the girl doesn't have to keep running over with refills. Bascom Swicegood liked to have bacon at waffles after the egg interlude and the earlier courses. But he was nearly at the end of his breakfast when he jumped up. What did you say? He was surprised at the violence of his own voice. What did who say, Mr. Swicegood? That girl that was just here. That just left with the other girl. That was Teresa, and the other girl was Agnes. Or else that was Agnes, and the other girl was Teresa. It depends on which girl you mean. I don't know what either of them said. Bascom ran out into the street. Girl, the girl who sat at rain dirty green all the time. What's your name? My name's Teresa. You've met me 4 times. Every morning you look like you never saw me before. I'm Agnes, said Agnes. What did you mean it rained dirty green all the time? Tell me about it. I will not, Mr. Swicegood. I was just telling a dream I had to Agnes. It isn't any of your business. Well, I have to hear all of it. Tell me everything you dreamed. I will not. It was a dirty dream. It isn't any of your business. If you weren't a friend of my uncle Aunt Kelly, I'd call a policeman for your bothering me. Did you have things like live rats in your stomach to digest for you? Did they... Oh, how did you know? Get away from me. I will call a policeman. Mr. McCarty, this man is annoying me. The devil he is, Miss Ananias. Old Bascom just doesn't have it in him anymore. There's no more harm in him than a lamppost. Did the lampposts have hair on them, Miss Teresa? Did their pendants swell and smell green? Oh, you couldn't know, you awful man! I'm Agnes, said Agnes, but Teresa dragged Agnes away with her. What is the lamppost jag, Biscombe? Asked Officer Mossback McCarthy. Oh, I know what it's like to be in hell, Mossback. I dreamed of it last night. And well you should, a man who neglects his Easter duty year after year. But the lamppost jag, if it concerns anything on my beat, I have to know about it. It seems that I've had the same depressing dream as the young lady, identical in every detail. Not knowing what dreams are, and we do not know, we should not find it strange that two people might have the same dream. There may not be enough of them to go around, and most dreams are forgotten in the morning. Bascom Swicegood had forgotten his dismal dream. He could not account for a state of depression until he heard Teresa Ananias telling pieces of her own dream to Agnes Schoenapfel. Even then it came back to him slowly at first, but afterwards with a rush. The oddity wasn't that two people should have the same dream, but that they should discover the coincidence. What, with the thousands of people running around and most of the dreams forgotten? Yet, if it were a coincidence, it was a multiplex one. On the night when it was first made manifest, it must have been dreamed by quite a number of people in one medium-large city. There was a small piece in an afternoon paper. One doctor had 5 different worried patients who had had dreams of rats in their stomachs and hair growing on the insides of their mouth. This was the first publication of the shared dream phenomenon. The script did not mention the foul green rain background, but later investigation uncovered that this and other details were common to the dreams. But it was a reporter named Willie Waggoner who really put the town on the map. Until he did the job, the incidents and notices had been isolated. Dr. Jerome Judas had been putting together some notes on the green rain syndrome, Dr. Florence Appian had been working up his evidence on the Zurich's ventriculus trauma, and Professor Gideon Greathouse had come to some learned conclusions on the inner meaning of words. But it was Willie Waggoner who went to the people for it, and then gave his conclusions back to the people. Willie said that he had interviewed 1,000 people at random. He hadn't really. He had talked to about 20. It takes longer than you might think to interview 1,000 people. He reported that slightly more than 67% had had a dream of the same repulsive world. He reported that more than 44% had had the dream more than once, 32% more than twice, 27% more than 3 times. Many had had it every damned night, and many refused frostily to answer questions on the subject at all. This was 10 days after Bascom Swicegood had heard Teresa Ananias tell her dream to Agnes. Willie published the opinions of the 3 learned gentlemen above, and the theories and comments of many more. He also appended a hatful of answers he had received that were sheer levity. But the phenomenon wasn't local. Waggoner's article was the first comprehensive, or at least wordy, treatment of it, but only by hours. Similar things were in other papers that very afternoon, and the next day. It was more than a fad. Those who called it a fad fell silent after they themselves experienced the dream. The suicide index arose around the country and the world. The thing was now international. The cacophonous ditty Green Rain was on all the jukes, as was the Warthog song. People began to loathe themselves and each other. Women feared that they should give birth to monsters. There were new perversions committed in the name of the thing, and several orgiastic societies were formed with a stomach rat as a symbol. All entertainment was forgotten, and this was the only topic. Nervous disorders took a fearful rise, as people tried to stay awake to avoid the abomination, and as they slept in spite of themselves and suffered the degradation. It is no joke to experience the same loathsome dream all night, every night. It had actually come to that. All the people were dreaming it all night, every night. It had passed from being a joke to being a universal menace. Even the sudden new millionaires who rushed their cures to the market were not happy. They also suffered whenever they slept, and they knew that their cures were not cures. There were large amounts posted for anyone who could cure the populace of the Warthog people dreams. There was presidential edict and dictator decree, and military teams attacked the thing as a military problem, but they were not able to subdue it. Then, one night, a nervous lady heard a voice in a noisome dream. It was one of the repulsive cracked Warthog noises. "You are not dreaming," said the voice. "This is the real world. But when you wake, you will be dreaming. That bare-faced world is not a world at all. It is only a dream. This is the real world." The lady awoke howling, and she had not howled before, for she was a demure lady. Nor was she the only one who awoke howling. There were hundreds, then thousands, then millions. The voice spoke to all, and engendered a doubt. Which was the real world? Almost equal time was now spent in each, for the people had come to need more sleep, and most of them had arrived at spending a full 12 hours or more in the nightmarish world. It could be, was the title of a headline article on the subject by the same Professor Greathouse mentioned above. It could be, he said, that the world on which the green rain fell incessantly was the real world. It could be that the warthogs were real and the people a dream. It could be that rats in their stomachs were normal and other methods of digestion were chimerical. And then a very great man went on the air in worldwide broadcast with a speech that was a ringing call for collective sanity. It was the hour of decision, he said. The decision would be made, things were at an exact balance, and the balance would be tipped. But we can decide, one way or the other. We will decide. I implore you all, in the name of sanity, that you decide right. One world or the other will be the world of tomorrow. One of them is real, and one of them is a dream. Both are with us now, and the favour can go to either. But listen to me here. Whichever one wins, the other will have always been a dream, a momentary madness soon forgotten. I urge you to the sanity which in a measure I have lost myself. Yet in our darkened dilemma, I feel that we yet have a choice. Choose! And perhaps that was the turning point. The mad dream disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. The world came back to normal with an embarrassed laugh. It was all over. It had lasted from its inception 6 weeks. Bascom Swicegood, a morning type, felt excellent this morning. He breakfasted at Kale's, and he ordered heavily as always. And he listened with half an ear to the conversation of 2 girls at the table next to his. "But I should know you," he said. "Of course, I'm Teresa." "I'm Agnes," said Agnes. "Mr. Swicegood, how could you forget? It was when the dreams first came, and you overheard me telling mine to Agnes. Then you ran after us in the street because you had had the same dream, and I wanted to have you arrested. Weren't they horrible dreams? And have they ever found out what caused them?" "They were horrible, but they have not found out. They ascribe it to group mania, which is meaningless. And now there are those who say that the dreams never came at all, and soon they will be nearly forgotten. But the horror of them, the loneliness. Yes, we hadn't even pediculi to curry our body hair. We almost hadn't any body hair." Teresa was an attractive girl. She had a cute trick of popping the smallest rat out of her mouth so it could see what was coming into her stomach. She was bulbous and beautiful. "Like a sack full of skunk cabbage," Bascom murmured admiringly in his head, and then flushed green at his forwardness of phrase. Teresa had protuberances upon protuberances, and warts on warts, and hair all over hair where she wasn't warts and bumps. "Like a latrine mop," sighed Bascom with true admiration. The cracked clang of Teresa's voice was music in the early morning. All was right with the earth again. Gone the hideous nightmare world when people had stood barefaced and lonely, without bodily friends or dependents. Gone that ghastly world of the sick blue sky and the near absence of entrancing odour. Bascom attacked manfully his plate of prime carrion, and outside the pungent green rain fell incessantly. End of Dream World by R.A. Lafferty.
A Dream of Wild Bees by Olive Schreiner. Recorded for Dreams Collection 1, Stories and Poems by Newgatenovelist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Dream of Wild Bees by Olive Schreiner. A mother sat alone at an open window. Through it came the voices of the children as they played under the acacia trees, and the breath of the hot afternoon air. In and out of the room flew the bees, the wild bees, with their legs yellow with pollen, going to and from the acacia trees, droning all the while. She sat on a low chair before the table and darned. She took her work from the great basket that stood before her on the table. Some lay on her knee and half covered the book that rested there. She watched the needle go in and out, and the dreary hum of the bees, and the noise of the children's voices became a confused murmur in her ears as she worked slowly and more slowly. Then the bees, the long-legged, wasp-like fellows who make no honey, flew closer and closer to her head, droning. Then she grew more and more drowsy, and she laid her hand, with the stocking over it, on the edge of the table, and leaned her head upon it. And the voices of the children outside grew more and more dreamy, came now far, now near. Then she did not hear them, but she felt under her heart where the 9th child lay. Bent forward and sleeping there, with the bees flying about her head, she had a weird brain picture. She thought the bees lengthened and lengthened themselves out, and became human creatures and moved round and round her. Then one came to her softly, saying, "Let me lay my hand upon thy side where the child sleeps. If I touch him, he shall be as I." She asked, "Who are you?" And he said, "I am Health. Whom I touch will have always the red blood dancing in his veins. He will not know weariness nor pain. Life will be a long laugh to him." "No," said another, "let me touch, for I am Wealth. If I touch him, material care shall not feed on him. He shall live on the blood and sinews of his fellow men, if he will, and what his eye lusts for, his hand will have. He shall not know I want." And the child lay still like lead. And another said, "Let me touch him, I am Fame. The man I touch I lead to a high hill where all men may see him. When he dies he is not forgotten, his name rings down the centuries, each echoes it on to his fellows. Think, not to be forgotten through the ages." And the mother lay breathing steadily, but in the brain picture they pressed closer to her. "Let me touch the child," said one, "for I am Love. If I touch him he shall not walk through life alone. In the greatest dark, when he puts out his hand, he shall find another hand by it. When the world is against him, another shall say, 'You and I.'" And the child trembled. But another pressed close and said, "Let me touch, for I am Talent. I can do all things that have been done before. I touch the soldier, the statesman, the thinker, and the politician who succeed, and the writer who is never before his time and never behind it. If I touch the child, he shall not weep for failure." About the mother's head the bees were flying, touching her with their long tapering limbs, and, in her brain picture, out of the shadow of the room came one with sallow face, deep lined, the cheeks drawn into hollows, and a mouth smiling quiveringly. He stretched out his hand, and the mother drew back and cried, "Who are you?" He answered nothing, and she looked up between his eyelids. And she said, "What can you give the child? Health?" And he said, "The man I touch, there wakes up in his blood a burning fever that shall lick his blood as fire. The fever that I will give him shall be cured when his life is cured." "You give wealth?" He shook his head. "The man whom I touch, when he bends to pick up gold, he sees suddenly a light over his head in the sky. While he looks up to see it, the gold slips from between his fingers, or sometimes another passing takes it from them. Fame? He answered, Likely not. For the man I touch there is a path traced out in the sand by a finger which no man sees. That he must follow. Sometimes it leads almost to the top, and then turns down suddenly into the valley. He must follow it, though none else sees the tracing. Love? He said, He shall hunger for it, but he shall not find it. When he stretches out his arms to it and would lay his heart against a thing he loves, then, far off along the horizon, he shall see a light play. He must go towards it. The thing he loves will not journey with him. He must travel alone. When he presses somewhat to his burning heart, crying, Mine, mine, my own, he shall hear a voice. Renounce, renounce, this is not thine. He shall succeed? He said, He shall fail. When he runs with others, they shall reach the goal before him. For strange voices shall call to him, and strange lights shall beckon him, and he must wait and listen. And this shall be the strangest. Far off across the burning sands where, to other men, there is only the desert's waste, he shall see a blue sea. On that sea the sun shines always, and the water is blue as burning amethyst, and the foam is white on the shore. A great land rises from it, and he shall see upon the mountain tops burning gold. The mother said, He shall reach it. And he smiled curiously. She said, Is it real? And he said, What is real? And she looked up between his half-closed eyelids and said, Touch. And he leaned forward and laid his hand upon the sleeper and whispered to it, smiling. And this only she heard. This shall be thy reward, that the ideal shall be real to thee. And the child trembled, but the mother slept on heavily, and her brain picture vanished. But deep within her the antenatal thing that lay here had a dream. In those eyes that had never seen the day, in that half-shaped brain was a sensation of light, light that it never had seen, light that perhaps it never should see, light that existed somewhere. And already it had its reward. The ideal was real to it. London. End of A Dream of Wild Bees by Olive Schreiner.
A Remembered Dream by Henry Van Dyke, read for Dreams Collection 1, Stories and Poems. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Remembered Dream by Henry Van Dyke. This is the story of a dream that came to me some 25 years ago. It is as vivid in memory as anything that I have ever seen in the outward world, as distinct as any experience through which I have ever passed. Not all dreams are thus remembered, but some are. In the records of the mind, where the inner chronicle of life is written, they are intensely clear and veridical. I shall try to tell the story of this dream with an absolute faithfulness, adding nothing and leaving nothing out, but writing the narrative just as if the thing were real. Perhaps it was. Who can say? In the course of a journey, of the beginning and end of which I know nothing, I had come to a great city, whose name, if it was ever told me, I cannot recall. It was evidently a very ancient place. The dwelling houses and larger buildings were grey and beautiful with age, and the streets wound in and out among them wonderfully, like a maze. This city lay beside a river or estuary, though that was something that I did not find out until later, as you will see. And the newer part of the town extended mainly on a wide, bare street running along a kind of low cliff or embankment, where the basements of the small houses on the water side went down below the level of the street to the shore. But the older part of the town was closely and intricately built, with gabled roofs and heavy carved facades hanging over the narrow stone-paved ways, which here and there led out suddenly into open squares. It was in what appeared to be the largest and most important of these squares that I was standing, a little before midnight. I had left my wife and our little girl in the lodging which we had found, and walked out alone to visit the sleeping town. The night sky was clear, save for a few filmy clouds which floated over the face of the full moon, obscuring it for an instant, but never completely hiding it, like veils in a shadow dance. The spire of the great cathedral was silver filigree on the moonlit side, and on the other side black lace. The square was empty, but on the broad, shallow steps in front of the main entrance of the cathedral, 2 heroic figures were seated. At first I thought they were statues. Then I perceived they were alive, and talking earnestly together. They were like Greek gods, very strong and beautiful, and naked but for some slight drapery that fell snow-white around them. They glistened in the moonlight. I could not hear what they were saying, yet I could see that they were in a dispute which went to the very roots of life. They resembled each other strangely in form and feature, like twin brothers, but the face of one was noble, lofty, calm, full of a vast regret and compassion. The face of the other was proud, resentful, drawn with passion. He appeared to be accusing and renouncing his companion, breaking away from an ancient friendship in a swift, implacable hatred. But the companion seemed to plead with him and lean toward him and try to draw him closer. A strange fear and sorrow shook my heart. I felt that this mysterious contest was something of immense importance, a secret, ominous strife, a menace to the world. Then the 2 figures stood up, marvelously alike in strength and beauty, yet absolutely different in expression and bearing, the one serene and benignant, the other fierce and threatening. The quiet one was still pleading, with a hand laid upon the other's shoulder, but he shook it off and thrust his companion away with a proud, impatient gesture. At last I heard him speak. "I have done with you," he cried. "I do not believe in you. I have no more need of you. I renounce you. I will live without you. Away, forever out of my life." At this a look of ineffable sorrow and pity came upon the great companion's face. "You are free," he answered. "I have only besought you, never constrained you. Since you will have it so, I must leave you, now, to yourself." He rose into the air, still looking downward with wise eyes full of grief and warning, until he vanished in silence beyond the thin clouds. The other did not look up, but lifting his head with a defiant laugh, shook his shoulders as if they were free of a burden. He strode swiftly around the corner of the cathedral and disappeared among the deep shadows. A sense of intolerable calamity fell upon me. I said to myself, "That was man, and the other was God, and they have parted." Then the multitude of bells hidden in the lacework of the high tower began to sound. It was not the aerial, fluttering music of the carillon, which I remembered hearing long ago from the belfries of the Low Countries. This was a confused and strident ringing, jangled and broken, full of sudden tumults and discords, as if the tower were shaken and the bells gave out their notes at hazard, in surprise and trepidation. It stopped as suddenly as it began. The great bell of the hour struck 12. The windows of the cathedral glowed faintly with a light from within. "It is New Year's Eve," I thought, although I knew perfectly well that the time was late summer. I had seen that, though the leaves on the trees of the square were no longer fresh, they had not yet fallen. I was certain that I must go into the cathedral. The western entrance was shut. I hurried to the south side. The dark, low door of the transept was open. I went in. The building was dimly lighted by huge candles which flickered and smoked like torches. I noticed that one of them, fastened against a pillar, was burning crooked, and the tallow ran down its side in thick white tears. The nave of the church was packed with a vast throng of people, all standing closely crowded together like the undergrowth in a forest. The rood screen was open or broken down, I could not tell which. The choir was bare like a clearing in the woods, and filled with blazing light. On the high steps, with his back to the altar, stood man, his face gleaming with pride. "I am the Lord," he cried. "There is none above me, no law, no God. Man is power, man is the highest of all." A tremor of wonder and dismay, of excitement and division, shivered through the crowd. Some covered their faces, others stretched out their hands, others shook their fists in the air. A tumult of voices broke from the multitude, voices of exultation and anger and horror and strife. The floor of the cathedral was moved and lifted by a mysterious groundswell. The pillars trembled and wavered. The candles flared and went out. The crowd, stricken dumb with a panic fear, rushed to the doors, burst open the main entrance, and struggling in furious silence poured out of the building. I was swept along with them, striving to keep on my feet. One thought possessed me. I must get to my wife and child, save them, bring them out of this accursed city. As I hurried across the square, I looked up at the cathedral spire. It was swaying and rocking in the air like the mast of a ship at sea. The lacework fell from it in blocks of stone. The people rushed screaming through the rain of death. Many were struck down and lay where they fell. I ran as fast as I could, but it was impossible to run far. Every street and alley vomited men, all struggling together, fighting, shouting, or shrieking, striking one another down, trampling over the fallen. A hideous melee. There was an incessant rattling noise in the air, and heavier peals as of thunder shook the houses. Here a wide rent yawned in a wall, there a roof caved in. The windows fell into the street in showers of broken glass. How I got through this inferno I do not know. Buffeted and blinded, stumbling and scrambling to my feet again, turning this way or that way to avoid the thickest centers of the strife, oppressed and paralyzed by a feeling of impotence that put an iron band around my heart, driven always by the intense longing to reach my wife and child, somehow I had a sense of struggling on. Then I came into a quieter quarter of the town, and ran until I reached the lodging where I had left them. They were waiting just inside the door, anxious and trembling, but I was amazed to find them so little panic-stricken. The little girl had her doll in her arms. "What is it?" asked my wife. "What must we do?" "Come," I cried. "Something frightful has happened here. I can't explain now. We must get away at once. Come, quickly." Then I took a hand of each, and we hastened through the streets, vaguely staring away from the center of the city. Presently we came into that wide new street of mean houses of which I have already spoken. There were a few people in it, but they moved heavily and feebly, as if some mortal illness lay upon them. Their faces were pale and haggard with a helpless anxiety to escape more quickly. The houses seemed half deserted. The shades were drawn, the doors closed. But since it was all so quiet, I thought we might find some temporary shelter there, so I knocked at the door of a house where there was a dim light behind the drawn shade in one of the windows. After a while the door was opened by a woman who held the end of her shawl across her mouth. All that I could see was the black sorrow of her eyes. "Go away," she said slowly. "The plague is here. My children are dying of it. You must not come in. Go away." So we hurried on through the plague-smitten street, burdened with a new fear. Soon we saw a house on the riverside, which looked absolutely empty. The shades were up, the windows open, the doors stood ajar. I hesitated, plucked up my courage, resolved that we must get to the waterside in some way in order to escape from the net of death which encircled us. "Come," I said, "let us try to go down through this house, but cover your mouths." We groped through the empty passageway and down the basement stair. The thick cobwebs swept my face. I noted them with joy, for I thought they proved that the house had been deserted for some time, and so perhaps it might not be infected. We descended into a room which seemed to have been the kitchen. There was a stove dimly visible at one side, and an old broken kettle on the floor, over which we stumbled. The back door was locked, but it swung outward as I broke it open. We stood upon a narrow, dingy beach, where the small waves were lapping. By this time the little day had begun to whiten the eastern sky. A pallid light was diffused. I could see westward down to the main harbour, beside the heart of the city. The sails and smokestacks of the great ships were visible, all passing out to sea. I wished that we were there. Here in front of us the water seemed shallower. It was probably only a tributary or backwater of the main stream, but it was sprinkled with smaller vessels, sloops and yawls and luggers, all filled with people and slowly creeping seaward. There was one little boat quite near to us, which seemed to be waiting for someone. There were some people on it, but it was not crowded. "Come," I said, "this is for us. We must wade out to it." So I took my wife by the hand and the child in the other arm, and we went into the water. Soon it came up to our knees, to our waists. "Hurry," shouted the old man at the tiller. "No time to spare." "Just a minute more," I answered. "Only 1 minute." That minute seemed like a year. The sail of the boat was shaking in the wind. When it filled, she must move away. We waded on, and at last I grasped the gunwale of the boat. I lifted the child in and helped my wife to climb over the side. They clung to me. The little vessel began to move gently away. "Get in," cried the old man sharply. "Get in quick." But I felt that I could not. I dared not. I let go of the boat. I cried "Goodbye," and turned to wade ashore. I was compelled to go back to the doomed city. I must know what would come of the parting of man from God. The tide was running out more swiftly. The water swirled around my knees. I awoke. But the dream remained with me, just as I have told it to you. End of A Remembered Dream by Henry Van Dyke.